I have kept a journal for 31 years. This is not, I hasten to say, a habit born of vanity. I am not the sort of man who imagines his own recollections to be of consequence to the world. I am Oliver Pemberton, steward of Caldermere Hall, keeper of its household accounts, overseer of its gardens, stables, staff, and cellars, occasional mediator between the upper housemaids and the lower cook, and for 16 of those 31 years, the closest thing Edward Ashbourne, the 6th Duke of Caldermere, has had to a friend. I know the distinction between a friend and a retainer, and I know that the Duke would bristle at the former word applied to me. Nevertheless, 16 years of shared silences, shared winters, and one shared grief will make a thing true whether or not either party chooses to name it. I kept the journal because my memory, reliable as it has been in matters of tenancy rolls and household expenditure, has always betrayed me in matters of the heart. Not my own heart, that is a simpler organ than most, given to no great passions and content with its modest measure of satisfactions. I mean the hearts of others. The turns of feeling that move through a house like weather, visible only after they have passed and changed everything. I kept the journal so I would not misremember. What follows is drawn from it. The events of the year in question, which I will, for the purposes of those who did not live through it, call the year of the 12 refusals, followed by the one choice, are set down here as I observed them, from my customary position of 6 feet behind the Duke, 2 steps to the left, and possessed of eyes that he often forgot were there. I will begin, as all things at Caldermere begin, with the hall itself. Caldermere Hall sits in the valley of a fictional county that the Ashbourne family has inhabited for 3 centuries, and which, owing to their considerable influence over the county records, appears on no map produced by a cartographer not in their employ. The valley is long and cold, and very beautiful in a manner that does not invite compliments. The hills to the north are gray and close. The river that crosses the southern park is black in winter and green-brown in summer, and has flooded the lower meadows in 11 of the 16 years I have served here, which is a fact I know because I am the one who arranges the remedial works each time, and because I once made the mistake of complaining about it to the Duke, and he said, in a tone of complete finality, "The river has flooded those meadows since the time of the first Duke." I see no reason to expect otherwise. That was the end of the conversation. The hall is a sprawling, uneven building, added to in every generation by an Ashbourne who felt that some corner of it was inadequate. The result is a house that has no clear logic but considerable character, corridors that widen unexpectedly, staircases that arrive at rooms no longer used for their original purpose, windows placed to catch light that has not fallen the same way since a stand of oaks matured in the last century. I know every one of its 240 rooms. I know which floorboards announce a visitor before they knock, which chimneys draw in a south wind, which guest bedrooms are warm in November, and which will freeze a man of moderate constitution by December. I know the hall, in short, the way a man knows a place he has devoted his adult life to. With respect, with occasional exasperation, and with a love so habitual it is indistinguishable from the air he breathes. The Duke knows it the same way, and more so. He was born in the East Wing, in the room his mother chose because it faced the garden, and she believed that the first light a child sees should be green. His father died when he was 14, and he became the Duke of Caldermere before he had finished growing. He took hold of the title and the responsibilities it carried with a seriousness that impressed everyone who observed it, and that I suspect cost him more than anyone knew, because 14 is very young to stop being a boy and very young to feel that you must not be seen failing at anything. He did not fail at anything. That, too, was its own kind of cost. He married at 23 a young woman of excellent family and genuine warmth named Charlotte, whom I will not describe at length because her loss is not this story's center, though it shaped the man who is. She died in the 2nd year of their marriage. There was a child expected. There was not a child delivered. I will say only that the Edward Ashbourne who returned to Caldermere from London in the autumn of that year was not the same man who had left it in the spring, and that the armoring that took place in the following months was so thorough and so quietly accomplished that even I, who watched it happen, could not always find the seam where the armor began and the man ended. He was 37 when this story begins. He had been a widower for 9 years. He was the most feared duke in the county, possibly in 3 counties, owing to a combination of genuine authority and economy of manner that most people mistook for coldness. and a face that, in repose, conveyed a degree of settled displeasure with the world that the world found entirely convincing. He was not, in my private judgment, a cold man. He was a careful one. There is a difference, though it requires a great deal of proximity to observe it. He was also, and here I arrive at the proximate cause of the year in question, the legal guardian and sole family of one Lady Cecily Ashbourne, his sister, who was 12 years old when this story begins, and who was, from the hour of her birth, the most deliberately managed, thoroughly observed, and cheerfully impervious child I have ever had the pleasure of knowing. Cecily Ashbourne arrived in the world at a point when her parents had long since given up expecting her. She was, as a consequence, the most welcome surprise the Hall had ever received, and she grew up in an atmosphere of such concentrated love that it either ought to have spoiled her entirely or made her extraordinary, and it made her extraordinary. She had her brother's eyes, dark, precise, seeing everything, but where his face was a closed door, hers was a window flung open regardless of the weather. She laughed easily. She asked questions without fear of the answer. She could read a room faster than most adults I knew, assess what it needed, and produce it, and then look innocent when anyone suggested she had done it on purpose. I adored her. The Duke worshipped her, in the particular manner of a man who believes himself incapable of worship, and has therefore never noticed he is doing it. It was Cecily's education that brought Miss Alara Vane to Caldermere. I should say first that Cecily had not been without instruction. She had had a succession of governesses beginning at age 7, sensible women, competent women, women with excellent references and a reasonable command of their subjects. She had got through them at a rate that alarmed me and did not seem to alarm her in the least. The first had lasted 8 months before giving notice on grounds she described in her leaving letter as irreconcilable pedagogical differences, which I had read twice before understanding that Cecily had argued her into a standstill on the history of the Crusades, and she had decided she would rather not continue. The second had stayed a full year, which I attributed to her phlegmatic temperament and her tendency not to engage with any topic she found complicated. Cecily had eventually grown bored with this arrangement. The third had been excellent, and I was sorry to lose her, but she had received a proposal from a gentleman in Derbyshire, and quite reasonably chosen a life of her own over continued employment at Caldermere. The fourth had lasted 3 weeks, and the less said about that the better. It was now October, and Cecily was without instruction, and the Duke had told me in the way that means he will not repeat himself that the matter was to be resolved before the month was out. I had applied through the usual channels to the agency in York that had supplied the previous 4, and had received from them the name of Miss Alara Vane, late of a position in Northamptonshire, with references described as superlative, and a list of subjects that included French, Italian, geography, natural history, mathematics through the middle levels, history both ancient and modern, drawing and music. I had read the references. I had conducted the correspondence. I had arranged the interview, which the Duke had declined to attend, on the grounds that he trusted my judgment in household matters, which meant he considered this a household matter, which meant he was not paying attention, which was entirely normal. Miss Alara Vane arrived on a Wednesday in the first week of October, on the afternoon coach from York, and I collected her in the smaller carriage because the road was already soft from autumn rain, and the larger carriage had a tendency to bog in the lower lane. My first impression, a young woman of perhaps 26 or 7, of moderate height and slender build, wearing a traveling dress the color of wet slate that had the look of a garment very well cared for, pressed with attention, mended with skill, not new. She had dark hair arranged with the neatness of someone who had done the arranging herself. Her face was, by the standards I have been trained by 30 years of aristocratic proximity to apply, unremarkable, pleasant features, a clear complexion, a pair of gray eyes that observed the carriage approach without anxiety and without deference, which was already unusual. Most new arrivals to Caldermere either braced themselves against the intimidating scale of the place or performed a careful, studied indifference to it. Miss Vane looked at the hall as it came into view around the final bend and said, quite simply, "Oh." "The hall, miss," I offered. "Yes," she said, "I can see that." And then, after a moment, "It's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Something cold," she said. "The references all said it was cold, efficient. Well ordered." "All of those things are true," I said. Yes, she said, looking at the east wing where the light was coming through the oaks in long golden bars. But it's also beautiful. They didn't mention the beautiful part. I remember thinking at that moment that she was going to be interesting. I did not imagine then quite how interesting. We reached the hall and I showed her to the rooms designated for the governess, comfortable rooms, on the third floor of the east wing, with a sitting room, a bedroom, and a small study that had once been used by the second Duchess for correspondence, and still had her writing desk in it. A massive carved walnut thing that filled the room in a way Miss Vane clearly found amusing. She ran a hand along its edge, looked at the inkwell that had been there since before I was born, and said, "I'll keep it." "Most of the previous governesses moved it to the corridor," I said. "Most of the previous governesses are not here," she said mildly. "I'm going to need a great deal of desk." I liked her for that. Cecily met her that evening at supper, which in the hall meant the schoolroom supper, which I had arranged to be served with a slightly better quality of pudding than usual as a gesture of welcome. I know this because Cecily sent me a small note, delivered by her personal maid Dot, which said only, "The pudding was excellent. She noticed and said so. I think she is going to do." The note was signed with Cecily's customary mark, which was a small horse, drawn in great haste and bearing no resemblance to any horse I have observed in the stable, and which she had used as a signature since she was 7. Good, I thought, good. The Duke met Miss Vane for the first time 4 days after her arrival, which is a fact I note because it tells you something about the geography of the hall and something about how its master moved through it. Caldermere was large enough, and the Duke's days sufficiently contained within the library, the estate office, the stables, and the western wing in general, that the eastern wing, where the governess's rooms were, and where the schoolroom occupied the best-lit corner of the third floor, was a country he did not visit with any frequency. He encountered her in the corridor outside the library, which I knew would happen eventually because I had observed that Miss Vane's habit, after Cecily's lessons were done in the afternoon, was to take her exercise by walking the length of the hall, all of it, from east to west and back, which meant she passed the library twice in each circuit. She did this, she told me when I asked, because she liked to keep herself physically active and because she wanted to know the shape of the house she lived in. Both explanations were entirely reasonable, and I suspected both were true. On the 4th day of her time at the hall, she was on the westward leg of her circuit when the Duke came out of the library, carrying a book he had clearly been reading while walking, because he did not look up until he had nearly walked into her. He stopped, he looked up. He appeared to process the information that there was a woman in his corridor who was not a housemaid and was not someone he recognized. "Who are you?" he said. It was not, I should note, a rude question in the context of Caldermere. The Duke spoke in that manner to everyone he did not immediately place, and some people he did. It was the tone of a man who believes that the fastest route to information is the most direct question. Miss Vane did not blink. "Alara Vane," she said, "Lady Cecily's governess. I arrived on Wednesday." "You were expected," the Duke said. It was not clear from his tone whether this was a welcome or a mere acknowledgement of prior information. "I was," she said, "and I arrived. The two things have now corresponded, which I find satisfying." There was a pause. The Duke looked at her for a moment the way he looked at the weather reports from the North Fields, assessing, calculating, temporarily uncertain what to do with the data. "Is Cecily working?" he said. "Cecily is at her pianoforte until 4. After 4, she is at her Latin, which she is finding disagreeable. I expect you will hear her opinion of Latin at dinner if she joins you." "She always joins me," the Duke said, which told me, when I heard the account, that the question of whether Cecily dined with her brother was not in question. What was in question was what mood she would arrive in. "Then I imagine we will all be better informed about the state of Roman verbs by this evening," Miss Vane said, and continued walking. I am told the Duke stood in the corridor for a moment after she had gone, looking at the space she had recently occupied. Then he went back into the library. He told me that evening, when I came to him with the estate correspondence, that the new governess seemed capable. "I believe so, Your Grace," I said. "Cecily likes her," he said, which was not a question. "Lady Cecily has pronounced her very satisfactory," I said, which, given the previous 4, I consider high praise. The Duke said and turned back to his correspondence. That was the end of it. for approximately 6 weeks. I should pause here to explain the matter of the 12 refusals, because without them the year makes considerably less sense. The previous year, the year before Miss Vane's arrival, the Duke's aunt, a formidable woman named Lady Harriet Comstock who lived in Bath and devoted her considerable energies to the management of other people's lives, had written to the Duke to say that it was past time he considered remarrying. She had written, over the course of 11 months, 7 letters on this subject, each one escalating slightly in directness, to none of which the Duke had replied. She had then come to Caldermere for a fortnight in August, at the end of which fortnight she had extracted from him a promise, the nature and precise wording of which I was not present for, but the practical consequence of which was that he had agreed to present himself in London for the following season and allow himself to be introduced to suitable candidates. Whether he had agreed because he meant it, or because it was the only way to get Lady Harriet on the coach back to Bath, I cannot say. The Duke's reasons are not always visible even to me. He had gone to London. He had attended the season. He had met 12 young women of excellent family, excellent character, and every apparent qualification for the position of Duchess of Caldermere. He had refused all 12, not publicly, not cruelly, not in any way that created scandal, but with a finality that communicated itself clearly enough to the parties concerned and to Lady Harriet, who had written to me in considerable frustration, and asked me whether the Duke had a reason he was not sharing with her. I had written back that if he had not shared it with me either, which was true. He returned to Caldermere at the end of the season in July. 3 months later, Miss Vane arrived, and I, standing on that corridor in October with a household account in one hand and a tolerably clear view of a very long game, began to wonder whether the two things were connected. I did not say this to anyone. I noted it in the journal and watched. The first significant collision between the Duke and Miss Vane occurred in the 3rd week of November, in the library. Cecily had, for some weeks, been conducting an ongoing campaign to be allowed access to the upper shelves of the Duke's library, the ones that contained the histories, the scientific texts, the philosophical works, and several volumes of travel writing that she had identified as relevant to a project she was pursuing on the subject of the Ottoman Empire, about which she had developed a consuming interest following an afternoon with Miss Vane's Globe and a conversation about trade routes. The Duke had told Cecily that the upper library was for adult use and that she would have access when she was 15. Cecily had pointed out that she was 12, not 5, and that the book she wanted was a travel account written in 1772 by a clergyman who had clearly found the whole experience somewhat alarming, and that she had no interest in its alarming parts, only in its geographical ones. The Duke had said that 15 was the age, and he did not intend to revisit the subject. Cecily had retreated. I had assumed, not for the first time, that she had retreated because she intended to outflank. Miss Vane had, it emerged, been making inquiries of me about the library's catalogue. Not, she said, for the Ottoman travel account specifically, she had her own copy, but for the library's broader holdings in natural history, which she wanted to assess before planning a module of study she intended to introduce after Christmas. I had given her access to the catalogue room, which is adjacent to the library and is technically a separate space. She had spent 3 afternoons there with the bound catalogue. On the Wednesday of the 3rd week of November, she was in the catalogue room when the Duke came to return a book to the lower shelves. He came and went without ceremony. She did not immediately announce herself, because she was at the time in the process of reaching for a very high catalogue volume and was concentrating on not dropping it. She dropped it. It landed with considerable noise. The Duke came to the door of the catalogue room and found her on her knees picking up the pages that had shaken loose. It was an old catalogue, made before the current binding method, and it had never been a stable object. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace," she said from the floor without looking up. "I apologize for the noise." "What are you doing?" "Reassembling your catalogue of natural history holdings, which appears to have been mended at some point with a glue that has not lasted the decades." She fitted a loose signature back into the spine, squinted at it, and set it aside. "I would suggest having this rebound. The contents are not complete. There are acquisitions in the 1830s that haven't been entered, but the core is very good." "You have 3 works I wasn't aware of." The Duke looked at the catalogue, the scattered pages, and Miss Vane in that order. "How long have you been in here?" 3 afternoons this week. Mr. Pemberton gave me access. She looked up at him then. I hope that's correct. He said the catalog room was accessible to senior household staff. It is, the Duke said. Good. She stood, catalog in hand, and moved to the table. I'm planning a natural history module for Lady Cecily's winter studies. I wanted to see what we had before I sent for additional materials. You intend to spend the winter on natural history. Natural history, a continuation of mathematics, Italian. She's been making excellent progress with her Italian. And I thought, if you approved, some economics. Not academic economics, practical household economics. She'll manage an estate of her own someday, and I think it does girls no service to leave them ignorant of the foundations. There was a pause. I know this pause in retrospect, from what the Duke told me about it when he came to my office later that afternoon, which was itself unusual. The Duke does not generally report to me on his conversations. He said, "The governess has an opinion about Cecily's education." "She has several," I said. "I've found them generally reasonable." "She wants to teach her economics." "Practical economics," I said. "Household management, I think it's an excellent idea." The Duke said and looked at the fire. "She knows her subjects." "She does. She's not frightened of me." I considered this. "No," I said, "I don't believe she is." "Most people are frightened of me," the Duke said, not with any particular pride, simply as a statement of observed fact. "Most people haven't spent 3 months in a household where a 12-year-old treats them as an equal," I said. "I believe Miss Vane has developed some immunity to intimidation." The Duke made a sound that, in a less contained man, I might have described as a suppressed laugh. In him, it was the slight shift of the jaw that meant he had found something genuinely amusing, and had elected not to let it out. "The economics is approved," he said and left. November turned to December. The hall took on its winter arrangements. The fires lit earlier each day, the heavy curtains drawn against the early dark, the kitchen producing the slow-cooked dishes that the Duke preferred in cold weather, and that Cecily negotiated toward puddings with a persistence that I found admirable. Miss Vane settled into the household as if she had always been there, which is not something I say lightly. It is a particular skill to inhabit a place so naturally that its rhythms accommodate you without effort. The maids liked her because she was civil to them and did not treat them as invisible. The cook liked her because she could be consulted about menus without giving excessive opinions about them. I liked her because she did her job without drama, and because, when she had a question, she asked it directly and listened to the answer without performing either more or less understanding than she actually had. Cecily liked her for all of those reasons, and for several others that were less articulable and more to do with the particular recognition that passes between two minds of a similar quality when they encounter each other for the first time. What I observed over December was this. Miss Vane's curriculum was rigorous, interesting, and paced in a way that kept Cecily engaged without exhausting her. The Latin which Cecily had initially resented had been reframed by Miss Vane as a code to be cracked rather than a grammar to be memorized, and Cecily, whose mind responded instantly to the concept of codes, had ceased complaining about it. The natural history module had moved from taxonomy to observation. Miss Vane had set up a daily practice of recorded observation, a small notebook in which Cecily was required to write 3 things she had noticed that day about the natural world, which had resulted in Cecily developing a habit of looking closely at things she had previously walked past, which was, I thought, one of the most valuable things education can produce. The economics module had been a revelation. Cecily had not known, before it, how much a pound of flour cost, or how many servants it took to run a house of this size, or what the terms of a tenancy agreement meant in practical day-to-day terms. She knew all of these things by Christmas, and she knew them because Miss Vane had taught them as stories. The story of the flower's journey from the farm to the kitchen. The story of a family whose tenancy terms worked in their favor, and one whose terms did not. The story of how a household budget is a living document that requires constant renegotiation with reality. I told Miss Vane at Christmas that I had never seen Cecily so thoroughly engaged with her studies. "She's extraordinary," Miss Vane said, simply and without performance. "I mean that genuinely. She thinks sideways. She finds the unexpected entrance to a problem and uses it. Most children that age are still learning to move forward. She's already moving diagonally." She has had good instruction, I said. She has, Miss Vane agreed, and she has a brother who takes her seriously. She paused. That's not nothing, that's almost everything for a child like that. I looked at her. There was something in the way she said it, not wistful, not bitter, not pointed. Simply true and quietly felt. You understand that from experience? I asked, which was impertinent of me, and I knew it. I had a father who took me seriously, she said. I was very lucky. She looked at the window at the white garden. He died when I was 17. I had to find other ways to be taken seriously after that. She said it in the tone of a statement rather than a complaint, and moved on to discuss the arrangements for Cecily's holiday studies, and I did not follow her into whatever was behind those words. But I noted it. January brought Lady Harriet. I should have foreseen it. Lady Harriet's letter had arrived in December, and I had presented it to the Duke with the rest of his correspondence, and observed his face when he read it and thought, privately, that we were going to have a difficult winter. Lady Harriet's letter had said, in terms that only appeared measured on the surface, that she expected to visit Caldermere in January to discuss the matter of the Duke's future matrimonial arrangements, as she had received reports that the previous season's 12 presentations had produced no result, and that she was taking it upon herself to identify a 13th candidate, a Miss Lavinia Portmore, who was the niece of a baronet, had an income of her own, and had been described to Lady Harriet by 3 separate sources as both accomplished and amiable. The Duke had read this letter. He had placed it on his desk. He had looked at it for a moment the way he looked at documents he intended to dispute later. Then he had told me to write to Lady Harriet and say that she was welcome at Caldermere in the 2nd week of January. I had written. Lady Harriet had arrived. She was 63 years old, built like the prow of a ship, and moved through a room at a pace that suggested she had things to do and intended to do them. She had known Caldermere since before the Duke was born, and felt herself on familiar terms with it in a way that the current Duke found trying. She brought with her 2 trunks, a personal maid, a lapdog of indeterminate breed named Archimedes, and a set of opinions on the running of a country estate that differed from the Duke's in every particular. She also brought, by arrangement I later learned she had made independently of anyone at the hall, Miss Lavinia Portmore. Miss Portmore arrived 2 days after Lady Harriet, under the guise of accompanying a friend of Lady Harriet's who was visiting the nearby village. In practice, she arrived for tea on the 3rd day of Lady Harriet's visit, was installed in the drawing room with what I can only describe as strategic placement, and was presented to the Duke when he came in from the stables with mud on his boots and an expression that told me he had not known she was coming. Miss Portmore was by every objective measure an exceptional candidate. She was 24, handsome in the manner of a portrait that has been well planned, even features, well-arranged coloring, a composure that never visibly slipped. She spoke well on any subject raised. She played the pianoforte. She was, as Lady Harriet had said, possessed of her own income. She seemed, in short, designed specifically to be a duchess. The Duke was civil to her for 4 days. He asked her the correct questions and gave the correct responses to her answers. He showed her the gardens and the stables and the library, all of which she admired in terms that were precisely as enthusiastic as the situation required, and no more. He sat across from her at dinner 4 times and drank his wine with the expression of a man who is being very patient about something. On the 5th day, after Miss Portmore and her escort had departed, and Lady Harriet had retreated to her sitting room to write letters, the Duke came to my office. "No," he said. "Miss Portmore," I said. "No," he said again, in a tone that indicated this was also the end of the subject. "Lady Harriet will not be pleased," I said. "Lady Harriet," the Duke said, "is welcome to hold any opinion she likes about Miss Portmore, provided she does so in Bath." I noted this in the journal, Refusal 13. But something else happened during Lady Harriet's visit, which I feel is equally important to record. On the 3rd afternoon, while the Duke was in conference with Lady Harriet in the blue drawing-room, Cecily had her lessons with Miss Vane in the schoolroom as usual. I passed the schoolroom at approximately 2:30, on my way to the wine cellar to assess the January inventory, and heard through the door a conversation that arrested me long enough to miss my inventory by a quarter of an hour. Cecily was asking Miss Vane about marriage. Not in the abstract, specifically about what made a good one in her opinion. Miss Vane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think the most important thing is whether the two people involved are honest with each other, whether they can say what they actually think without managing it first." "Managing it," Cecily said. "Deciding what you want the other person to think, and then arranging your words accordingly," Miss Vane said. "Rather than saying what you actually believe and letting them respond to that." "That sounds difficult," Cecily said. "It is," Miss Vane agreed. "It's the most difficult thing, I think, to be completely legible to another person and to trust them with that." There was a pause. "Do you think my brother is going to marry Miss Portmore?" Cecily said. "I don't know," Miss Vane said. "I don't think he likes her," Cecily said. "What makes you think that?" "He looks at her the way he looks at the correspondence from the Board of Commissioners," Cecily said. "Correctly, but without any feeling about it." Another pause. "That's a very perceptive observation," Miss Vane said. "He used to look at Charlotte differently," Cecily said, Charlotte being the late Duchess, whom Cecily had known only as a very young child. "I remember him looking at her and it was different. Even when I was little I could see it was different." "Yes," Miss Vane said quietly. "I think he's waiting for something," Cecily said. "Perhaps," Miss Vane said, "or perhaps he doesn't know he's waiting." I stood very still in the corridor for a moment, and then I continued to the wine cellar and did my inventory. And when I came back, I found myself thinking about what Cecily had said, that the Duke did not know he was waiting, and about the particular clarity with which a 12-year-old can sometimes see what the adults around her are too close to observe. February at Caldermere. The days lengthened very slightly, not enough to feel like spring, but enough to notice that something was turning somewhere underneath the cold. The river was high from snowmelt. The fields to the north were frost-gray and motionless. Inside the hall, the fires burned and the household moved in the patterns it had established, and life continued in all the ways that life continues when nothing dramatic is happening and something important is quietly beginning. I should describe at this point the particular architecture of a house like Caldermere during the hours after lessons and before dinner, because it is in those hours, between 4 and 7 in the evening, that most of what I am about to describe occurred. In those hours, the Duke was generally in the library or the estate office. Cecily was generally somewhere she was not supposed to be, occupied in something she had not informed anyone about. Miss Vane was, and this was the pattern I had observed since October, in motion. She walked. She read in the window seat of the east corridor. She sometimes came to the kitchen to consult with cook about ingredients for a practical lesson she was planning. She occasionally appeared in my office with a question that required no answer beyond the question itself. The question was the point, and the conversation it opened. She also, increasingly, appeared in the vicinity of the library. I do not say this as an accusation. The catalog room was adjacent to the library, and she had legitimate business there throughout the spring as she continued to build out the curriculum. I also do not say it as evidence that she was deliberately seeking the Duke's company. I do not believe she was, or if she was doing it so unconsciously that the unconscious version was operating under entirely its own authority. What I say is simply, they were, with growing frequency, in the same part of the house at the same time, and the conversations that resulted were of a character that I found increasingly interesting to record. There was the conversation about the Peloponnesian War, which began when the Duke came out of the library to find Miss Vane sitting in the corridor window seat with Thucydides open on her lap, looked at the book, and said without preamble, "You're reading Thucydides." "I am," she said. "In Greek." "In translation, I'm afraid. My Greek is functional but not fluent." "What's your judgment of the translation?" She looked up at him. "Which edition have you in the library?" He named it. She said it was not her preferred edition and gave her reason, a specific point about how the translator had handled the Melian dialogue, which she felt had lost something in his choices about register. The Duke came and sat on the window seat on the other side of the casement and asked her what she meant, specifically. She told him. They argued about it, with civility and without either party yielding, for the better part of 20 minutes, and at the end of it, the Duke had gone back into the library to retrieve his own copy and demonstrated his counterargument by reading 3 passages aloud. Miss Vane listened, considered, and said, "You're right about the second one. I maintain my position on the other 2. The Duke had looked at her over the top of the book and then looked at the passages again and then made the sound that was the suppressed laugh. He said, "Very well," and went back to the library, taking his copy with him. The next morning he sent, via his secretary, a note to Miss Vane's schoolroom. It contained the title and library location of an essay on the Thucydides translation question written by a scholar at Oxford whose argument, the note said, she might find relevant. It was signed only C for Caldermere, which is how the Duke signs documents of estate business, and it was written on his personal stationery, which is not how estate documents are written. I know this because Miss Vane brought me the note and asked if she should reply, and I saw the stationery. "Reply if you have a substantive response to offer," I said. "He won't thank you for a polite acknowledgement." She thought about this. Then she went to the schoolroom and wrote a reply, which she gave to Cecily's maid, Dot, to deliver. Cecily's maid, Dot, I should note, was 14 years old and had a great deal of discretion for a girl her age, which meant that she delivered the note promptly and did not tell anyone about it, which meant that she definitely told Cecily immediately. Cecily sent me a small note with a horse on it. The horse, unusually, appeared to be dancing. March. The Duke had a conversation with his land agent about the spring drainage works for the lower meadows, and the land agent had suggested a particular approach to the riverbank shoring that the Duke found inadequate, and there had been a somewhat terse exchange that ended with the land agent departing, and the Duke coming to my office looking for someone to be rational at. I presented him with the estate correspondence and allowed him to work through it until the terse edge was gone. Miss Vane, that same morning, had taken Cecily outdoors for a natural history observation session in the south garden, because the snowdrops were up, and she had told Cecily that spring begins in the smallest places. They had spent an hour in the garden, and when they came in, Miss Vane's boots were wet, and Cecily was carrying a notebook full of observations about the way snowdrops opened at different angles relative to the light. She was also carrying a mud-stained drawing of what she described as a beetle, though it looked, honestly, more like a small coal with legs. The Duke passed them in the corridor on his way from the estate office to the library, and stopped. "What are you carrying?" he said to Cecily. "A beetle," she said. "That doesn't look like a beetle." "I'm still working on the drawing part," Cecily said, with considerable dignity. "Miss Vane says accurate observation and accurate rendering are different skills and both take practice." The Duke looked at Miss Vane. "Is that the day's lesson?" "Part of it," she said. "Natural history observation. The snowdrops are up. I wanted to see them before they passed. Lady Cecily's notebook will tell you more than I can summarize." She offered him the notebook without ceremony. The Duke took it, stood in the corridor, and read it through. He read it all the way to the last page, which contained Cecily's observation that snowdrops open differently on the eastern side of the garden than on the western side, which Miss Vane says is about the quality and angle of the light, and I want to know if this is true or if the individual plant also has an opinion about it. He looked up from the notebook. He looked at Miss Vane. He said, in a tone I had not heard him use before, not imperious, not assessing, something considerably less armored, "You've given her the habit of asking the next question." "I've given her permission to ask it," Miss Vane said. "She already had the habit." He looked at the notebook again. He handed it back to Cecily, who took it with an expression of studied innocence that fooled neither of us. "You'll both want dry boots," he said, and went to the library. But I noted that he did not go immediately to his reading. He stood for a moment at the library window that looked onto the south garden, as if seeing something I could not see from my position, and then he sat down, and he was quiet for a long time. I should describe, at some point, what manner of woman Miss Alara Vane was, because I have been describing her through her actions and her conversations, and that is the truest way to describe a person, but I am aware that it may leave something incomplete. She was not beautiful in the way that the word was commonly applied at Caldermere. That is, in the way it was applied to Miss Portmore, or to the other candidates of the previous season's 12 presentations. She was not the kind of woman who entered a room and drew the eye by any quality of surface. She entered rooms quietly, settled into them efficiently, and was most fully visible when she was engaged with something she found interesting, which produced in her face a quality of aliveness, a sharpening, a brightening, that was nothing so simple as beauty, but was something considerably more compelling. She had, I came to observe, a sense of humor so dry that it was sometimes invisible. She made observations that were funny and did not indicate by any change of expression that she had made them, so that you needed to be paying attention to catch them. The Duke, who had a similar quality, who was quite funny and had no interest in performing it, began to catch them, and catch them earlier. The slight jaw shift appeared more frequently when she was in his vicinity. She had principles. This is a thing that sounds commonplace, but is in practice less common than it ought to be. She had a set of things she believed were right, and a set of things she believed were wrong, and she conducted herself accordingly, and she did not announce the principles or hold them up for examination or use them to judge other people. They simply operated in her the way a wheel operates in a clock, invisibly but consequentially. She had, I believe, been a happy person before her father's death, and was still a happy person in the sense of being someone who found life fundamentally worthwhile. But there was underneath that happiness a place where something had been lost that had not been replaced, and the not replacing was not from lack of capacity, but from circumstance. She had not, as far as I could determine, been loved in the particular way she was capable of loving, or needed in the way a person like her needed to be needed. I write this with awareness that I am an old bachelor steward who has, in his 31 years of observation, developed some competence in reading people, and very little in other relevant matters. But I had watched many people come through Caldermere, and I had learned to see the ones who were living at full capacity, and the ones who were living at a fraction of it and waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for the circumstances that would let them open fully. Miss Vane was one of the latter. The Duke, it was becoming clear to me, was the other. April. A second letter from Lady Harriet arrived, saying that she had identified a 14th candidate, a young widow of good family named Mrs. Ellsworth, recently emerged from her period of mourning, possessed of 2 children and a generous settlement, and would the Duke consider meeting her at the Penthorne Assembly in May, which was an annual gathering of the better families of the county that Caldermere had attended in every generation for as long as anyone could remember. The Duke read this letter at breakfast and said, without looking up, "Tell Lady Harriet I will attend the Penthorne Assembly, and I make no other commitment." I wrote the letter. I noted the refusal in advance in the journal. But the more interesting thing happened later that morning, when I went to collect the breakfast tray from the library, where the Duke had taken his breakfast, having risen early and gone directly to work, and found him not at his desk, but standing at the window that faced east, which faced, at that particular time of morning, the upper garden where I could see, at some distance, the small figures of Cecily and Miss Vane. They were measuring something. I could not tell what at that distance, but there was a length of string involved and a considerable amount of consultation between them and a great deal of moving around. The Duke was watching them. He did not know I had come in. I set the tray quietly on the side table and stood for a moment, and in that moment I saw something I had not seen in the 9 years since Charlotte's death. I saw the Duke's face in an unguarded moment. Not the public face, not the estate management face, not the 12 refusals face. His actual face, the one that was underneath everything else. He was watching Miss Vane explain something to Cecily with a length of string, and his face was open. That is the only word I have for it. Open. The armoring was simply not there. He was watching her, and there was something in the watching that was not casual. It was the watching of a man who finds the thing he is looking at very important, and has not yet admitted to himself that he finds it very important, and is therefore standing at a window watching it with an expression of naked, helpless attention that he would have found extremely embarrassing if anyone had pointed it out to him. I left the tray and withdrew without making a sound. I wrote in the journal that evening, "He is going to need some time, or something is going to have to happen. I am not sure which." What happened was the matter of the books. Cecily had, by April, been working with Miss Vane for 6 months, and her progression through the curriculum had reached the point where she required reference texts that the schoolroom did not contain. Specifically, she was pursuing a project on the history of trade routes in the early modern period, a natural extension of the economics module, which had expanded outward with the particular unstoppability of Cecily's interests, and she needed maps. Large, detailed historical maps, the kind that lived in the upper library. She had not forgotten that the upper library was, by her brother's edict, 15 and older only. She had, however, identified the solution. She asked Miss Vane to request access on her behalf. Miss Vane had come to my office first and asked whether she thought this was a reasonable request to make. "Access to the upper library," I said. "For the purposes of the Trade Routes Project," she said. She's been working on it for 3 weeks. The maps she needs are the 1780s survey series. I know they're in the upper library because I found them in the catalog. I wouldn't be asking her to read anything inappropriate. It's cartography. It's not my decision to make, I said. The restriction was the Duke's. I know, she said. Should I ask him? That would be the correct approach, I said, and did not say anything else. And she looked at me for a moment with the particular look she sometimes gave me that suggested she suspected I had more to say and had chosen not to. And then she thanked me and left. She went to the estate office that afternoon, a place she had never previously gone, because the estate office was in the western wing, and she generally restricted herself to the east and the central corridor. She knocked, the Duke's secretary admitted her. She asked to speak with the Duke. He came out of the inner office. Miss Vane. Your Grace, I apologize for interrupting. I have a request regarding Lady Cecily's studies. Come in, he said, and stood aside. I have the account from both parties, from Miss Vane, who told me afterward because I think she wanted to be sure she had presented the case correctly, and from the Duke, who mentioned it that evening in a tone of someone who is still processing what has just happened to them. She had explained the trade routes project, and the maps, and the reason the 1780s survey series was specifically required, and she had concluded by saying that she understood the restriction was in place for good reasons, and she was not asking him to overturn a general rule, but simply to make an exception for a specific academic purpose. The Duke had listened to all of this. He had asked 2 questions, both of which were about the project rather than the access question. Specifically, what period of trade history Cecily was focusing on, and whether she had read the standard accounts or was working from primary sources. Miss Vane had answered in some detail. The Duke had asked a follow-up question. She had answered that too. They had in the estate office at 4:30 in the afternoon a conversation about early modern trade history that lasted 20 minutes, and ended with the Duke saying that Cecily could have access to the upper library under Miss Vane's supervision for the duration of the trade routes project, and that the maps she needed were also available in the portfolio cabinet in the corridor outside the library, which he would have unlocked. Thank you, Miss Vane said. She's doing serious work, the Duke said, which was not quite an answer to her thanks, but was something more valuable. He paused. You're directing it well. She directs herself, Miss Vane said. I mostly point at interesting doors. He looked at her. You're too modest. She seemed genuinely surprised by this. Am I? You know what she needs and when she needs it and in what order, he said. That's not pointing at doors, that's architecture. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Thank you, Your Grace, I didn't expect that. No, he said, and there was something in the way he said it that contained, I thought when I heard his account later, an awareness that he did not say such things often enough, and perhaps a small private surprise that it was to her that he was saying it. She left. He came to find me 20 minutes later and told me about the portfolio cabinet, and that the maps should be available to Miss Vane and Cecily. Certainly, I said. Shall I unlock it now? Tomorrow, he said, and Pemberton, he paused. Has Miss Vane been satisfied with her situation here? With her rooms, her board, the conditions generally? I looked at him. As far as I'm aware, yes, she has made no complaints. She wouldn't, he said, which struck me as a very accurate observation about a woman he had, up until 6 months ago, barely registered as a presence in his house. I'll inquire, I said, if you wish me to. If she needs anything, he said, and left it there. I made a note in the journal. The Penthorne Assembly was in the 3rd week of May. It was, as always, an occasion. The county's better families assembled at Penthorne Hall, a substantial country house belonging to the Penthorne family, who had held the manor for 2 centuries, and who considered the annual assembly one of their chief contributions to local civilization. And the drawing rooms were opened, and the chandeliers lit, and there was music, and there was dancing, and there was, inevitably, an elaborate sociological machinery of introductions and assessments operating just below the surface of the dancing. Caldermere attended in full formal array, which meant the Duke in his evening dress, which he wore with the same impassive authority he wore everything, and myself in my own formal clothes, because I had been attending the Penthorne Assembly and the Duke's party for 16 years, and the Penthornes expected me, and Cecily, whose attendance at social occasions had been a subject of some negotiation because she was 12 and not in any formal sense out, but who had been permitted to come for the first half of the evening on the grounds that it was educational. Miss Vane was invited. This was unusual. She was staff, and staff did not generally attend the assembly. But Cecily had made the case to her brother that Miss Vane's presence was essential on the grounds that Cecily needed a companion for the early portion of the evening, and I, as the Duke's steward, was not an appropriate companion for a 12-year-old at a social occasion. This was, strictly speaking, correct. The Duke had approved it. I suspect he was aware that the argument was thinner than it appeared and approved it anyway. Miss Vane came in a dress of dark blue silk that was clearly not new but was clearly very well cared for, and she wore it with the same uncomplicated naturalness she wore everything. And when she walked into the Penthorne drawing rooms on Cecily's arm, I saw the specific moment when several of the county's better families realized she was there and began trying to place her. Lady Harriet was there. She had traveled from Bath for the purpose of introducing the Duke to Mrs. Ellsworth, the young widow who was the 14th candidate, and she accomplished this introduction with considerable tactical skill at the first available opportunity, drawing the Duke into a conversation with Mrs. Ellsworth in the front drawing room where the light was good, and the seating arrangement favored continued conversation. I watched from across the room. Mrs. Ellsworth was a pleasant woman, composed, appropriate, possessed of a warmth that seemed genuine. The Duke was civil. He asked her questions. She answered them. He listened to the answers. He was also, at 20-minute intervals, looking across the room to where Cecily and Miss Vane were seated. Not obviously, not in a way that anyone who was not paying close attention would have noticed. But I was paying close attention, and I noticed. He looked in the way that a man looks at something he needs to keep track of, except that what he was keeping track of was not Cecily, or not only Cecily, and the looking had the quality of something he was doing involuntarily rather than deliberately. Miss Vane, across the room, was talking to an older gentleman I recognized as a retired captain who lived in the village and came to the assembly every year, and whose chief interest was the Napoleonic campaigns. She was listening to him with the full presence attention she gave everything, and she was, from what I could observe at the distance, asking him questions that clearly pleased him, because he became more animated as the conversation went on, and at one point he produced a small notebook and showed her something in it. Cecily, beside her, was eating a meringue with great concentration and looking at nothing in particular, which meant she was looking at everything. The Duke excused himself from Mrs. Ellsworth at a natural break in the conversation, civil, appropriate, not discourteous, and crossed the room, not directly toward Miss Vane. He came to speak to the retired captain, whom he knew from the estate's dealings with the village, and in the course of this he was introduced by the captain. "Your Grace, I believe you know Miss Vane, Lady Cecily's governess, who has been asking me the most sensible questions about the Oporto campaign," and stood for a moment in a group of three, the captain and Miss Vane and himself, and the captain told the Duke about the questions she had been asking, and the Duke looked at Miss Vane with an expression that I, across the room, could only describe as interested. Not the assessment interest of January or the evaluating interest of October, something else, something warmer and more unsettled. He said, later that evening, in the carriage back to Caldermere, with Cecily asleep against the window, and Miss Vane sitting very quietly on the opposite seat watching the dark fields go past, that the captain had spoken very highly of the evening's conversation. "He's an excellent source," Miss Vane said. "He was there, so much of what we read about those campaigns is second-hand." "He'll come to the hall," the Duke said. "He's been meaning to look at the military documents in the archive. I'll have him for an afternoon." "Lady Cecily would benefit from speaking to him directly," Miss Vane said, "if he's willing." "I'll ask him," the Duke said. They did not say anything else for a while. The carriage moved through the dark. Cecily breathed quietly against the window. Miss Vane looked at the fields, and the Duke looked at Miss Vane, and I looked at the roof of the carriage and thought about the journal entry I was going to write when I got home. The retired captain came to Caldermere 3 weeks later, and it was a very good afternoon for everyone concerned. He spent an hour with the Duke in the archive, an hour and a half with Cecily and Miss Vane in the schoolroom, and then tea with all four of us, during which he told stories about the campaigns that were both historically informative and rather alarming, and Cecily produced her notebook and filled 4 pages without pause. After the captain had been seen to his carriage, the Duke went to the window and stood looking at the drive. "Pemberton," he said. "Your Grace, the trade routes project, is it complete?" I checked my information. Lady Cecily presented it to Miss Vane last Thursday. I believe it was received very well. "What's next?" "I understand Miss Vane is beginning a module on natural sciences," I said. "Lady Cecily has expressed interest in astronomy." The Duke was quiet for a moment. "I have a telescope," he said. "In the attic store. It was my father's." "I know," I said. "If it's still functional." "I believe it is. It was well maintained." He nodded. He looked at the drive for another moment. Then he said, "Have it brought down to the East Tower room. The view is clear from there." "Of course," I said. He left. I stood by the window for a moment. The captain's carriage was a small dot at the end of the drive. The south garden was green and bright in the early June sun. I went to find Miss Vane. She was in the schoolroom making notes for the astronomy module. She looked up when I knocked. "The Duke has asked that his father's telescope be moved to the East Tower room," I said. "He thought Lady Cecily might use it for the astronomy studies." Miss Vane looked at me for a moment. Then she said very simply, "That's very kind of him." "He can be," I said, and she nodded, and that was all, but we both understood it was considerably more than it appeared. June. The telescope was installed in the East Tower room, and Cecily used it with the concentrated fervor of a child who has just discovered that the sky is an entirely different country from the one she had been inhabiting. She dragged Miss Vane to the tower at every opportunity. She catalogued every visible body she could identify, filling notebooks with careful observations and imprecise drawings. She asked me to acquire 3 books on astronomy that she had found listed in the catalog and which were not in the library's holdings. I acquired them. She also, inevitably, persuaded her brother to come to the tower one clear summer evening to look through the telescope. I do not know whose idea this was, Cecily's, almost certainly, but I suspect she had assistance in the planning. What I know is that on a Wednesday evening in the 2nd week of June, the Duke went to the East Tower room and found Cecily at the telescope and Miss Vane beside her with an open book. And they spent an hour in the tower, the 3 of them, while the sky darkened and the stars came out, and Cecily showed her brother what she had learned. I was not there. I know what happened because the Duke told me the next morning that Cecily had shown him Saturn's rings and he had been, he said, somewhat taken aback by the experience. "It's not something you expect," he said, "to be surprised by a planet." "No," I agreed. "She's very good at this," he said, "the explaining, the pointing at things." "Miss Vane or Lady Cecily?" He paused. "Both," he said. And then he added, which was unusual, "Miss Vane explained the mechanics of the rings. She has a gift for making the technical accessible without condescending to the listener." "I've noticed that," I said. "She's wasted as a governess," he said. I looked at him. He looked at the window, and there was, in his expression, the quality I had seen in April, the unguarded openness, present for just a moment before the armor went back into place. "I mean," he said, more contained, "that she could do a great deal more than instruct one child." "Perhaps," I said, "though the instruction of one particular child is not, I think, a small thing." "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." July brought the Penthorne summer gathering, a smaller, less formal occasion than the May Assembly, an afternoon in the gardens of Penthorne Hall with the families of the county who wished to come, and Caldermere attended, Duke and all. Cecily had been agitating for the chance to show her astronomy observations to the retired captain, who she had reason to believe would appreciate them. I suspected this was true, but I also suspected that Cecily's reasons for wanting to attend had been arrived at by a more circuitous route than simple interest in the captain's opinion. Miss Vane came again. She wore the dark blue dress that I had decided was her best, and she wore it with the same unhurried self-possession, and I noticed the Duke notice when she arrived. There was a woman at the Penthorne gathering, a neighbor of the Penthornes, a Mrs. Hathaway, who was the particular variety of county matron who makes it her business to know things, and to share those things with a selectivity that produces maximum social effect, who had been, since the May Assembly, quietly inquiring into the nature of Miss Vane's position at Caldermere. This was not, in itself, remarkable. A new arrival of any kind at the county's major houses tended to attract interest. What was notable was what Mrs. Hathaway chose to do with the information she had gathered. She approached me at the Penthorne summer gathering and inquired with an air of pleasant social conversation about Miss Vane. Was she, Mrs. Hathaway inquired, quite firmly in her position at Caldermere? Had she good references? She had heard, she said, some talk about the previous situation in Northamptonshire. Nothing definite, you understand, but the sort of talk one hears. I have been a steward for 31 years. I have learned to recognize a probe when I receive one. I answered Mrs. Hathaway's questions with the courteous but entirely uninformative manner I have developed over decades, and I told Miss Vane about it at the first available opportunity. Miss Vane listened to this without visible alarm. She's the third person to ask me something similar since May, she said. Has she? Two other ladies at the May Assembly. I didn't think much of it at the time. She was quiet for a moment. What do you think she's heard? I don't know, I said. But I intend to find out. It took me a fortnight. The information, once I had it, was unpleasant and specific. A man named Mr. Carew, a neighbor of the Caldermere estate, with whom the Duke had a long-standing and unresolved dispute over a boundary line. A man of about 40 with considerable social ambitions and an appetite for leverage, had apparently heard something from the Northamptonshire household about Miss Vane's departure from her previous position. What he had heard, and what he was quietly circulating through the county, was that she had left the Northamptonshire position under circumstances that were not entirely as clean as the reference suggested. That there had been an attachment, he implied, of an unsuitable kind. This was, as far as I could determine, a malicious fabrication. I could not find a single specific claim. It was the particular kind of slander that is impossible to directly refute because it offers nothing concrete to refute, only the shape of an insinuation. I wrote to the Northamptonshire household. The reply I received from the principal's secretary was curt and unambiguous. Miss Vane had left the position in excellent standing, with the full confidence of the family, for reasons of the family's restructuring rather than any deficiency on her part, and any representation to the contrary was entirely without foundation. I brought this intelligence to the Duke. He read the letter from Northamptonshire. He read the intelligence I had compiled about Carew's circulation of the insinuation. He set it all down on his desk. He was very still for a moment. How long has this been circulating? He said. Since approximately May, I said. I believe it began at the Penthorne Assembly. Has she been told? I told her 2 weeks ago that Mrs. Hathaway had been making inquiries. I did not know then what was behind it. Tell her now, he said, today. Yes, Your Grace. He was quiet again. Carew, he said. Yes, I said. He is currently, you will correct me if I have the dates wrong, in breach of his obligations under the terms of the 1819 boundary agreement, which required him to maintain the drainage on the east side of the wall by the end of last quarter, which he has not done, resulting in standing water on 3 acres of my lower field. That is correct, I said. I have been patient about this matter, he said. You have. I am going to be considerably less patient, he said. That seems appropriate, I said. He stood up. He was, I noted, very tall when he stood to his full height with that particular set to his shoulders that meant he had made a decision and intended to enact it. Is she in the hall today? Miss Vane, yes, lessons finished at 4. I believe she's in the catalog room. He left the estate office without another word. I sat for a moment, looking at the intelligence report on the desk, and then I followed at what I considered a respectful distance. He did not go to the catalog room, as I had expected. He went first to find Cecily, which surprised me. He found her in the schoolroom, finishing some work Miss Vane had set for the afternoon. He sat down across from her, which he rarely did in the schoolroom. He generally appeared in doorways, not at the table. Cecil, he said, the diminutive he used for her in private. Edward, she said, which is what she called him in private. I need to tell you something, he said. She put down her pen. He told her, briefly and without concealment, what Carew had been saying about Miss Vane, and that he was going to address it, and that she should hear it from him rather than from anyone else. Cecily was quiet for a moment. Her face had the expression it got when she was angry about something important, not the bright surface anger of small frustrations, but the deeper, quieter anger of injustice. "It's not true," she said. "No," he said, "it isn't." "He's saying it because of the boundary dispute," she said. The Duke looked at her. "What do you know about the boundary dispute?" "I know everything about the boundary dispute," Cecily said. "Pemberton mentioned it once, and I read the file." There was a pause that contained, I thought, a great many things the Duke had not said to Cecily about the fact that she read files she was not specifically invited to read. "The boundary dispute is being resolved," he said. "Good," Cecily said. "And what about Miss Vane?" "I'm going to speak to her," he said. Cecily looked at her brother with the unnerving clarity she sometimes deployed. "And then," she said. "And then," he said, and he paused, and something crossed his face that was the most unguarded thing I had seen from him in perhaps 9 years. "I am going to say something I should have said some time ago. To her, and to anyone else who might benefit from hearing it." Cecily looked at him for a long moment. "Good," she said, and picked up her pen. He was at the door when Cecily said, without looking up from her work, "Edward." "Yes." "She won't make it easy for you," she said. "She'll want to be sure you mean it." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "I know," and left. He found Miss Vane in the catalog room. She was at the table with a set of reference texts open in front of her and her notebook open beside them, working with the concentrated quietness that was her characteristic mode. She looked up when he entered. "Your Grace," she said, with the slight puzzlement she sometimes showed at his appearances in this part of the house. Not unwelcoming, simply noting the departure from his usual territory. He closed the door. This was, I should note, entirely proper. The catalog room had a window onto the corridor with the standard library glazing, but it was also, for Caldermere, unusual. The Duke did not generally close doors behind himself. She saw this. Her posture, which had been open and slightly questioning, became careful. "Miss Vane," he said, "I need to speak with you about something, and I want to speak plainly, so I ask that you listen before you respond." "Of course," she said. He told her what Caro had been circulating. He told her what he had learned from the Northamptonshire household. He told her, without softening it, that the insinuation had been in the county's social circulation since May, and that she might have encountered it already in forms she had not recognized. She was very still throughout this. When he had finished, she said, "I see. The information from Northamptonshire is clear," he said. "There is no foundation to the insinuation. The matter is being addressed directly." "I appreciate that," she said. Her voice was even. "Thank you for telling me." "There is something else I want to say," he said. She waited. He was quiet for a moment. I was, at that point, in the corridor outside the catalog room window, which faces the corridor in the glazed way I have mentioned, and I could see them both through it, the Duke at the door, very still, Miss Vane at the table, very careful, and between them the quality of air that accumulates in a room where something important is about to happen, and both parties know it, and neither party knows quite how to proceed. "I have been," he said, "insufficiently, I have been less clear than I should have been for some time about—" He stopped. He began again. "When Cecily asked me at the beginning of the year why I had not found the previous season satisfactory, I told her it was a question of temperament." Miss Vane waited. "That was not entirely accurate," he said. She was very quiet. "The truth," he said, "which I have been arriving at slowly and which I should have recognized considerably earlier than I did, is that for some months the year has been—" He stopped again. He seemed to make a decision, and when he continued his voice was quieter but steadier. "I have not wanted to make a particular choice because I was, without knowing it, already making a different one. And because I was not paying attention to what I was doing, I did not see it until someone with considerably sharper eyes than mine showed it to me." Miss Vane said nothing. Her face was controlled. She was working very hard to keep it controlled, and only the way she was holding her hands on the table showed the effort. "I am not speaking well," he said. "I am aware of that. I have very little practice at this, and I find I cannot be indirect about it. It doesn't suit me and it won't suit you, and I think the situation deserves plain speech." He met her eyes. "I am in love with you. I have been for some time, and I was the last to know it, which is mortifying but apparently inevitable." I am telling you now because I should have told you sooner, and because I don't intend to make you defend a position in this county that I could make unassailable if you were willing to let me." The silence was complete. "Your Grace," she said and stopped. "Edward," he said, "please." She was quiet for a moment. "Then you must understand that I am not able to accept what you're describing simply because it would resolve a difficult situation. I would rather leave Caldermere than stay on those terms." "I know," he said. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking whether what I've described is, whether you have any feeling whether the year has been." He stopped. He had run out of indirect approaches, and he was, I could see, aware of it. She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were very bright. "I have spent 9 months," she said carefully, "trying very hard not to have the feeling you are describing. I have been thorough about it. It has not worked." He exhaled. "You frighten me," she said quietly. You are so defended for such good reason, and I was not willing to be the person who offered you something you hadn't asked for. I didn't know I couldn't tell." "I know," he said, and there was in his voice something I had not heard in a very long time, something released. "I know, I was very defended. I am not." He crossed the room to the table and stood in front of her. He did not touch her. He looked at her with the open face I had seen through the window in April. "I want to be honest with you about everything because that is what you require, and it is what I should have been practicing for some time. I cannot promise you that I will not sometimes be impossible. I know that I am. I can promise you that I will not stop paying attention. I have been paying attention to you, it turns out, for a very long time, and I don't know how to stop." She stood up from the table. She was almost as tall as his shoulder, and she looked up at him with an expression that was all the things she had been keeping behind the careful control, clear, full, unhidden. "You should know," she said, "that Cecily has been managing this for months." He looked at her. "The astronomy module," she said. "The trade routes project, the maps, the telescope. She has been very strategic." He was silent for a moment. Then the slight jaw shift happened, the almost laugh. And then the actual laugh, which was a real one, startled out of him, and which I had heard in 16 years, perhaps 4 times. "She really is extraordinary," he said. "She is," Miss Vane said. "She gets it from somewhere." He was quiet, looking at her. "May I?" he said, and stopped, and she understood what he was asking and gave him her hand, and he held it with the kind of care that is so careful it is almost unbearable to witness. "I want to do this properly," he said. "I want you to know that I mean it. I will speak to you again properly if you'll allow me, when you've had time." "Time," she said, and there was a very small and complicated smile on her face. 9 months seems like a great deal of time already." He looked at her for a moment, her hand in his, and the armor was simply absent. The full face, the man underneath everything. "Yes," he said, "it does. I should record for completeness how the matter of Carew was resolved. The Duke had a meeting with Carew's land agent within the week, which I attended in my capacity as steward, and the terms he presented were measured but unequivocal. The outstanding obligations under the 1819 boundary agreement were to be fulfilled within the month, and the Duke's solicitor would be formally engaged if they were not. There was no direct reference to the slander, because there did not need to be. The meeting communicated, without explicit statement, that the Duke of Caldermere was aware of the full picture, and was prepared to address it in its entirety. Carew's land agent wrote to me 2 days later with the assurance that the drainage works would be completed by the end of the month. They were. Mrs. Hathaway called at Caldermere the following week. Apparently she had heard something, in the way that Mrs. Hathaway always heard things, and I received her because the Duke was in London, where he had gone to arrange certain legal matters to do with an engagement he intended to announce upon his return. I told Mrs. Hathaway that Miss Vane was very well, that the household was very well, and that the Duke had the highest possible regard for her and she for him, and I said this last part in a tone that communicated very clearly what it meant. Mrs. Hathaway processed this information with the rapid efficiency of a woman who has spent 50 years being the first to know things, and concluded the call with the warmth of someone who intends to be on the right side of the new arrangement. Lady Harriet received a letter from the Duke from London. I do not know what it said, but her reply, which I saw when it arrived at the hall, was a single page, and the only part of it I could read through the envelope. I was not trying to read it through the envelope. The quality of the light in the letter room at that particular angle makes it possible to see through paper not intended to be seen through, was a phrase that appeared to say exactly what I have been telling you for 6 years. Which may have meant anything or nothing, and which I noted in the journal as entirely consistent with Lady Harriet's character. The Duke came back from London on a Friday afternoon. He arrived as he always arrived, without ceremony, in the estate carriage, shaking the travel out of his coat as he came through the front door. I was there to receive him with the usual papers and the usual briefing. He took the papers. He looked at them for approximately 30 seconds. "Where is she?" he said. "Miss Vane is in the schoolroom," I said. "Cecily is at her Italian." He handed me back the papers and went up the stairs. I followed at a distance, because I am not a man who misses things, and this seemed likely to be a thing worth not missing. The schoolroom door was open. Cecily was at the schoolroom table with her Italian exercise, and Miss Vane was at the window with a book. They both heard the footstep on the stairs, the particular weight and pace of it that is the Duke's and no one else's. Cecily looked up from her Italian. Miss Vane turned from the window. He came through the door and he looked at Alara Vane with the open face, entirely open, no armor anywhere, and he said, "I have spoken to a solicitor. I have spoken to a vicar. I have a ring in my pocket that was my grandmother's and that I would like very much to put on your hand if you are still willing." Cecily put down her pen with the air of someone who has been waiting for a very specific thing and has arrived at it. Miss Vane looked at him. Her face went through several things very quickly, surprise, though it was not quite surprise. Something that was relief and something that was overwhelmed and something that was very, very clear. "Still willing," she said. He crossed the room and he took her hand and he placed the ring on her finger, and it fit, because he had measured, not her hand, but a glove she had left in the catalog room months earlier. And I know this because I was the one who found the glove and did not give it back to her for 3 weeks, which was entirely deliberate. Cecily watched all of this with the satisfaction of a general observing a campaign she has managed from the outset, and when it was done she said, "I would like to point out that I knew in November." "We know," the Duke said, without looking away from Miss Vane. "I am simply noting it for the record," Cecily said. "Noted," Miss Vane said softly. Cecily picked up her pen and returned to her Italian, which she had perhaps 3 words of before she gave up the pretense and simply watched them, and I turned from the doorway and went down to my office and opened the journal on the desk to the day's date. I wrote, "She's going to be good for this house. She's going to be very good for him. The house has needed a woman who was not afraid of it, and he has needed, I am not certain I have the word exactly, but I believe it is, to be known, fully without the armor, by someone who looked and saw the man underneath and stayed." Cecily asked him in January whether he was waiting for something. He said perhaps. She said perhaps he did not know he was waiting. He did not know, he knows now. I closed the journal. Outside, the late summer afternoon was golden over the south garden, and the river, which was low in August, made its quiet sound over the stones. I could hear, from 2 floors above me, the particular sound of Cecily Ashbourne laughing at something, and I thought that this was among the finest sounds that Caldermere Hall had ever produced, and that it was going to become considerably more common. I noted this, too, in the margin. We married in October. Not the large society affair that the county might have expected. The Duke and Miss Vane were in agreement on this, for different reasons that arrived at the same conclusion. She did not want the performance of it. He did not want to share the occasion with a crowd of people who had spent the previous year assessing whether she was adequate for the position. Cecily agreed with great fervor and also pointed out, correctly, that she had not yet acquired an appropriate hat for a large church wedding, which settled the matter. The ceremony was in the village church, small, old, lit with candles because the October morning was gray, with the vicar who had known the Duke since he was a boy, and who performed the service with a warmth that suggested he had been hoping for this for some time. The witnesses were myself and Cecily, who wore a hat she had acquired at some speed from a milliner in the county town, and which was, by any standard I possess, a remarkable hat. Miss Vane, the Duchess of Caldermere, wore the slate-colored dress, which she had altered at the collar and which was, I had been told by the housemaid who helped her dress, the dress she had worn on her first day at Caldermere, arriving in the rain from the York coach. I thought that was right. I thought it was the right garment for a woman who wanted to mark the continuity between the person who had arrived and the person who was leaving, and to make clear that they were the same. The Duke saw her walk into the church, and his face did the thing it had been doing since April, opened entirely, without defense. And the vicar made a sound that might have been good morning, and might have been something considerably more personal, and the service began. Cecily wept, which she would deny afterward and continue to deny for the rest of her life. I did not weep. I am not a man who weeps. But I held, that morning, a great deal of feeling in a very small space, and I was grateful for the private arrangement of my face that made this invisible. In the weeks following the wedding, I began to observe something that I had not quite anticipated, though in retrospect I should have: the particular way that a house adjusts to being fully inhabited. Caldermere had been, for 9 years, a house that was very well maintained and not quite alive. The fires burned, the rooms were cleaned, the meals were served at the correct hours, the household functioned with a precision I was proud of. But there is a difference between a functioning house and a living one, and what the new Duchess brought to Caldermere was the second thing. She did not change it dramatically. She had no interest in dramatic changes. She learned its rhythms and then added to them small, permanent additions. A book moved to a particular window because the light was good. A new arrangement for the morning correspondence that took 15 minutes and reduced the Duke's visible frustration with the afternoon post by approximately a quarter. An agreement with Cook about the breakfast hour that benefited everyone, and which Cook told me later she had been wanting to propose for 6 years, but had never found the moment. She also continued to teach Cecily. This was not, I think, what anyone expected, the new Duchess of Caldermere continuing in a teaching role. But she said, to the question I did not ask her directly, that Cecily was in the middle of things and she saw no reason to interrupt. And the Duke said, to the same unasked question, that if she wanted to continue she should continue, and he had no intentions of telling the Duchess what to do with her time, which was both true and entirely in character. Cecily's education in the autumn expanded again. She had begun, under Miss Vane's instruction, the Duchess's instruction, to look at literature with the same attention she gave to natural history. She read widely. She wrote essays that her instructress marked with a thoroughness that I found instructive. She also, increasingly, sat with the Duke in the evenings in a way that had been habitual since she was small, but was now different, because there was a third person at the fireside, and the three of them talked. I occasionally passed the library door in those evenings and heard the talk. It was various: the Ottoman trade routes, the question of what makes a good translation, the progress of the drainage works in the lower meadow, the specific properties of Saturn's rings, the history of the Caldermere title, the problem of Caro's continued suboptimal management of his eastern field. It was the talk of a family. I have not heard that particular quality of talk in Caldermere Hall since Charlotte's death, and I had not expected to hear it again, and it moved me, without my permission, more than I was prepared for. There is one final thing I want to record. In November, a year, almost exactly, from the new Duchess's arrival on the October coach, I was in my office working on the tenancy renewals for the following quarter when there was a knock at the door. It was Cecily's maid, Dot, delivering a note. The note was on a small square of paper, and it bore, at the bottom, the small horse drawn in great haste that Cecily had used as her signature since she was 7. The note said, "I have been thinking about what you said last October when she arrived about whether she was going to be interesting. I wanted to tell you that I think you were right. She is the most interesting person I have ever met except for Edward and possibly yourself, though you must not tell anyone I said that last part. C. with horse." I kept the note. It is in the journal pressed between the pages for the October of her arrival, where I wrote, "The first time I saw the hall through her eyes. Oh, it's also beautiful." I have thought many times since about the shape of the year. The 12 refusals, all of them correct. The one choice also correct, and made so slowly and so quietly, and with such ordinary dailiness that neither the man nor the woman had seen it happening until it was already complete. A telescope moved from an attic. A glove kept 3 weeks longer than strictly necessary. A length of string in a garden. A conversation about Thucydides in a corridor. It is how the important things happen, in my experience. Not at once. Not dramatically. In the catalogue room, at the window, in the small daily proximity of a life shared under the same roof, with the particular intelligence and patience of a 12-year-old horse-drawing schemer who saw it in November and managed it from there. I could be wrong about the timing. I could be wrong about many things. I am, after all, a steward, not a philosopher. But I keep the journal, and the journal says, the year of the 12 refusals ended with one choice, made quietly, on an afternoon in July, in a room full of old catalogues and the smell of good paper, between two people who had been, in all the ways that mattered, choosing each other for a year without knowing what to call it. The choice held, as the good ones do. And Caldermere, which had been very well maintained, and not quite alive, became alive. That is what I have to record. That is all. I should go back. I have told this story in summary, because that is the habit of a man who has kept records for 31 years and knows that the shape of things is sometimes clearer in compression. But a shape is not the same as the thing itself, and the thing itself, the daily texture of it, the specific weight of each ordinary day that became extraordinary in retrospect, deserves better than outline. Let me begin again with November, which I passed over too quickly, and the particular quality of the hall in that first month that I have since understood to be the month when everything was already beginning, even though none of the parties most directly involved were aware of it. November at Caldermere is a specific experience. The trees along the drive lose their color in the first week, and for a day or two the ground is brilliant with leaves before the rain comes and makes them brown and flat. The upper meadows go the color of pewter. The river, which has been sluggish all autumn, begins to quicken again with the early season rains from the north, and on clear nights. The clear nights in November are very clear, the air being dry and cold, and the stars having an almost aggressive quality of visibility. You can hear the river from the east wing. I know this because the governess's rooms in the east wing are on the side that faces the river, and Miss Vane mentioned it to me in early November, saying that she found the sound conducive to sleep in a way that surprised her since she had grown up in a town where the equivalent night sound was considerably less musical. She mentioned it without complaint, simply as an observation. She was that kind of woman, deeply attentive to her surroundings, observational in the way that some people are as a practice, and she was as a nature, and willing to share what she observed with anyone she thought might find it interesting without performing her observations for approval. She told me about the river the way she might have pointed out a natural history specimen that she thought I would appreciate. Here is a thing I have noticed. I thought you might like to know. I wrote it down. I wrote most of what she said down in those months, because I had the sense from very early in her time at Caldermere that she was worth recording. I should also record what I know of her history, which I have assembled over the course of the year from various small accounts she gave me, and which I set down here as context for what followed. Lara Vane was the daughter of a physician, not a grand physician, but a dedicated one, a man named Dr. Vane who had practiced in a market town in the northern Midlands for 30 years, and who had, by all accounts, been a remarkable man. Self-educated beyond his formal training, widely read, genuinely curious about the world in a way that his profession allowed to be practical rather than merely academic. He had educated his daughter alongside himself. There had been a son, older, who had gone to Oxford and then into the church, and it had apparently been the physician's private opinion that his daughter had the better mind of the two, and he had made no secret of this opinion within the household, which had been the beginning of her confidence, and the beginning, too, of a habit of taking her own intellect seriously that had not always served her comfortably in a world that did not universally agree with her father's assessment. Dr. Vane died of a lung condition when Alara was 17, in the winter of her brother's second year at Oxford. The practice had gone to a younger physician who had bought the goodwill. The house was rented. The brother had his college allowance and his prospects, and a mild, reasonable regret for his sister's situation that did not translate into any particular action on her behalf. Miss Vane had had to make herself useful, and quickly. She had been a governess since she was 18, 9 years, by the time she came to Caldermere. She was good at it, and she knew she was good at it, but she was also aware, with the particular clarity of a woman who has been doing one thing excellently for 9 years, that being good at the thing you must do is not quite the same as doing the thing you would have chosen. What would you have chosen? I asked her once in the spring, when we were reviewing the curriculum for the following term and the conversation had moved, as it sometimes did between us, from the practical to the more general. Something with more scope, she said. Something that could accumulate. She paused. Teaching is strange. You spend a great deal of time putting things into a person, and then they leave and they take the things with them, and you start again with someone new, which is wonderful. But there's a particular kind of knowledge that wants to build, that wants to sit somewhere and grow into something, and that's the kind I have, and that doesn't always have somewhere useful to go. Research, I said. Perhaps. Natural history, I think, if I were going to be specific. She looked at the window. My father had a collection of beetles. He left them to me. I have them in a box under my bed. I've been adding to them very quietly for 9 years. I thought about this. I believe the Hall's collection of natural history works extends to entomology, I said. The catalog has several specialist texts. She looked at me. I know, she said. I found them in November. The matter of the beetles came to the Duke's attention in February, by a route so indirect that I am still not certain whether it was accidental. Cecily had, in the course of the natural history module, developed an interest in collection and categorization. She had been collecting specimens, pressed flowers, feathers, a small shell from the estate's ornamental lake, 2 interesting stones from the North Path, and organizing them in a cabinet she had acquired from the storeroom with my assistance. Miss Vane had given her a methodology for this, which I understood to be based on the Linnean system, but adapted for a 12-year-old's collection, and which produced in Cecily the same focused pleasure she derived from any system that had a clear logic and rewarded precision. On a Tuesday morning in mid-February, Cecily had brought to the schoolroom, for show and tell as it were, the box of beetles. She had asked Miss Vane if she could see them. Miss Vane had brought them out, and they had spent an hour with the box open on the table, and Cecily had filled 2 notebook pages with drawings and descriptions and questions. And at the end of the hour she had said, with the direct conviction she had inherited from somewhere, that Miss Vane's beetles were the finest thing she had ever seen. The Duke had come to the schoolroom that morning, as he occasionally did, to speak to Cecily about a letter from her music teacher in the village, who was requesting to know whether the lessons were to continue through spring. This was a reasonable question, and it had slipped his secretary's notice, and the Duke, who was in the habit at this point of going to the schoolroom more often than his schedule strictly required, and who would have been the last person in the hall to acknowledge this pattern, had come in person. He had found Cecily at the table with the beetle box and Miss Vane opposite her, and the scene had the quality of a pause, both of them looking up, the box open between them with its neat rows of pinned specimens, the morning light very good in the east-facing schoolroom. "What is this?" the Duke said, approaching the table. "Miss Vane's beetles," Cecily said. "Come and look." He came and looked. He was quiet for a moment, examining the specimens. "How many are there?" 47, Miss Vane said. "I started collecting at 17. Some of these are my father's, these 3 in the upper left corner. The rest are mine." "Where are they from?" "Various places. Northamptonshire has an excellent variety. There are 6 from the Caldermere grounds, the south garden mostly, and 1 from the stable yard." He looked up at her. "You've been collecting here." "In the evenings sometimes, if the weather's suitable. The south garden has better substrate than you might expect." She paused. "I hope that's all right." "Of course it's all right," he said, and there was something in his tone that was not quite irritated, but something adjacent to it, the particular note he sometimes used when he felt he should have known something and had not. "Have you ever had these properly identified?" "Not formally. I've cross-referenced the texts I have access to." "The Hall has the Fabrius volumes," he said. "Comprehensive, and the supplemental issued in 1832. I acquired it because Cecily had shown some interest in entomology in the autumn, and I thought we might add it to the curriculum." Miss Vane looked at him. She said nothing for a moment. "I didn't know that," she said. "Pemberton knows where they are," he said to me, without looking away from the beetle box. "Have them sent to the schoolroom." I said I would. "This one," he said, pointing to a specimen in the lower right, "I believe I've seen in the North Field. There's a population there in summer in the long grass." "Really?" Miss Vane said, and she leaned forward to look at the specimen he was indicating, and they were both looking at the same small beetle from a distance of approximately 18 inches, and Cecily, across the table, put her chin in her hand and watched them with an expression of comprehensive satisfaction. The music teacher's letter was not addressed for another 4 days, when I reminded the Duke of it. He had forgotten he had come to the schoolroom for a reason. The Fabrius volumes arrived in the schoolroom and stayed there for 3 weeks, during which time Miss Vane spent every available evening hour cross-referencing the specimens in the beetle box against the plates. She added notation to every specimen. She filled a separate notebook with her findings. She found, to her considerable excitement, that 2 of her specimens were varieties not individually listed in her own reference books, which were older and less comprehensive, and that they were, according to the Fabrius, associated with specific substrate conditions that she proceeded to map against the locations in which she had found them at Caldermere. She showed the Duke her findings the first time she saw him after completing them. This was in the corridor outside the library, which had remained, through the autumn and winter, the most reliable location for a conversation. She said without preamble, 2 of the specimens are varieties I'd incorrectly identified. The Fabrius has corrected me. The substrate correlation is interesting. I don't think anyone has mapped it specifically for the northern counties. I'd like to do it properly if there's time and access. He looked at the notebook she was holding out to him. He took it and read through her notes with the attention he gave documents he found genuinely interesting, which was a specific quality of stillness and focus that I had learned to recognize. The north field, he said, and the south garden and the stable yard, for the data I have so far. But I'd need to extend the survey to the east wood and the lower meadow and the river edge to have anything comprehensive. I'll have the maps of the estate pulled, he said. You can mark your survey points. She looked at him. You're interested in this? I'm interested in what's on the estate, he said, which was entirely true. The Duke was a meticulous steward of the land and had always attended to its natural systems as well as its agricultural ones. But the way he said it, and the way he was looking at the notebook, suggested an interest that was not solely proprietorial. Have you collected? She said. When I was a boy, he said. My father had a collection. I believe it's still in the attic. She looked at him. He looked at her. They were both, for a moment, thinking about the same thing. I believe, I said, that the collection is in the 3rd attic storage room on the north side. It was packed in cases when the 4th Duke died. They both looked at me. I've been here a long time, I said. The Duke's father's natural history collection was retrieved from the attic on a Saturday in March, and was found to be in excellent condition, having been packed with the thoroughness of someone who expected it to be unpacked. It contained, among other things, a beetle collection of approximately 200 specimens, far more comprehensive than Miss Vane's, as befitted a man who had had more time and more resources, a set of plant pressings, an ornithological record in 3 volumes, and a box of drawings in graphite that were clearly made from life, and showed a quality of observation that surprised the Duke, who had not known his father drew. We spread the collection out on the long table in the estate office, the largest unoccupied flat surface in the hall, and the Duke and Miss Vane and Cecily spent the better part of the afternoon examining it. I was present. I made myself useful with the wrappings and the labels and eventually tea. Cecily's attention moved from the beetle cases to the drawings and stayed there. She produced her notebook and began copying elements of the drawings with the absorbed focus she brought to anything that interested her. The drawings were excellent, not technically perfect, but full of careful life, each specimen rendered from multiple angles, the notation in a small, clear hand. I didn't know he did this, the Duke said at one point to no one in particular. Did you know him well? Miss Vane asked. She said it simply, without the caution most people used around the subject of the late Duke, which the Duke was accustomed to and which he found, I knew, more tiring than the subject itself. He died when I was 14, the Duke said. At 14, you know your parents in a specific way, in the way they are necessary. You don't yet know them as people. I've been finding out who he was for 23 years. He looked at the drawings. I didn't know he saw things this precisely. I knew he was interested in the estate. I knew he was thorough. I didn't know he had the kind of attention that produces this. It's a different kind of precision from the one I learned from my father, Miss Vane said. My father saw everything in terms of systems and relationships. Your father seems to have seen individually, each thing for itself. He looked at her. What does your father's kind of precision look like? I see systems, she said. I see the beetle and I also see the substrate and the microhabitat and the way they're connected. I can't see the beetle without seeing the relationships. Is that useful? It's limiting and useful equally, she said. I miss things that are purely individual. Cecily misses systems because she's so good at seeing the individual thing. We argue about it. We do not argue, Cecily said from her corner without looking up from her copying. We have vigorous disagreements. The distinction being, the Duke said. Arguing is when someone is wrong, Cecily said. Vigorous disagreement is when both people have a point and neither is going to yield. The Duke looked at his sister. When did you become a philosopher? I've always been a philosopher, Cecily said. You just don't always listen. Miss Vane's face contained, briefly, something she did not permit to become a full expression, and the Duke saw it, and the slight jaw shift appeared. What, he said. Nothing, she said very correctly. He looked at her for a moment. You're not going to tell me she's right. I don't involve myself in family discussions, she said. She's right, the Duke said, looking back at the drawings. Miss Vane looked at the drawings too. Yes, she said quietly, she usually is. I want to record here the particular quality of the Duke in the months between November and July that made what happened in July both surprising and, in retrospect, entirely inevitable. He was a man who had learned, after Charlotte, to manage himself at a very high level. He had learned to produce from the materials he had to work with, his intelligence, his authority, his genuine commitment to the estate and to Cecily, a version of himself that was fully functional and entirely stable. He was not pretending. The man he presented to the world was a real man. But there is a difference between the parts of oneself that have been cultivated and the parts that are simply there, unreconstructed, and the parts of the Duke that had not been cultivated for 9 years were the parts that got the better of him, gradually and then completely, over the course of that year. It showed in small things first. The corridor conversations, which had begun as professional exchanges and which were, by February, running to 45 minutes on some evenings. The library, which had been his private space for 9 years, in which he had begun leaving books where she might find them, not given explicitly, simply placed, in the catalog room or on the corridor window seat. A natural history text, an annotated edition of something they had disagreed about. Once, inexplicably, a cookbook, which I believe was an accident but which she had read with complete thoroughness, and returned with a note on its margins about the chemical basis of the rising agent in one of the recipes, which he had read and noted and not responded to for 3 weeks, and then responded to in a conversation about fermentation that had lasted an evening. The way he referred to her in conversation with me. In October, she had been the new governess. In November, Miss Vane. By February, she was she or her, without any need for antecedent, because in the context of any conversation I was having with the Duke there was, by February, only one she that could be meant. His arrival in the schoolroom, which by March was happening at an average frequency of 3 times a week, for reasons that became progressively more peripheral as time went on. A question for Cecily that could have been sent by note. A book he had decided to give the curriculum and could have given to me to pass on. Once, memorably, a question for Miss Vane about the natural history survey that he could have asked any morning in the corridor, and that he chose, instead, to come to the schoolroom to ask, which required him to walk through the entire length of the east wing and up 2 staircases. The manner in which he watched her, which changed in character between October and June in a way that I will try to describe precisely, because I think the precision matters. In October, assessment, the quality of a man evaluating new information. In November, attention, present, regular, consistent, the quality of a man who has found a thing reliable. In December, warmth, the quality of a man who finds a thing better than reliable, who finds it, and here I am choosing the word carefully, sustaining. In January, a managed quality, the warmth still there but something over it, a deliberateness, a containing. The quality of a man who has noticed something about his own attention and has elected not to examine it. In February, the managing becoming less effective. In March, the window, the south garden, the open face when he did not know anyone was watching. By May, something I can only describe as suffering. The particular suffering of a man who knows exactly what he wants and cannot yet see the path to it, and who has also, which makes it more complex rather than less, convinced himself for 9 years that he should not want anything so specific and personal again. He was not, I should say, unaware of what was happening to him. He had come to my office in late April, under the pretext of discussing the east fence repairs, and had discussed the east fence repairs for approximately 4 minutes, and then sat with his coffee and said nothing for another 10, which I had allowed, because sometimes the Duke needed to not speak in the company of someone who would not make the silence uncomfortable. At the end of the 10 minutes he had said, looking at the fire, "I am aware that I am spending a great deal of time in a part of the house that has no business relevance to me. The East Wing has the governess's rooms and the schoolroom," I said, "and the catalog room, which you have used on several occasions." "The catalog room," he said, "which I used once before October and have used 6 times since." "The holdings have been useful," I said. He looked at me, "Pemberton." "Your Grace." "I am not asking for information," he said. "I am—" He stopped. He set down his coffee. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. This was, coming from the Duke, a statement of remarkable vulnerability. He was not a man who admitted confusion. "With respect," I said, "I think you do. I think you are finding it difficult to know what to do about it." He was quiet. "She is in my employment," he said. "Yes," I said. "She has, I don't. I am aware that I have nothing to recommend me to her. I am not, I have been told by a number of people over a number of years that I am difficult. That I am—" He stopped. "Cold," I said. "Cold," he agreed, "or words to that effect." "You are not cold," I said. "You are careful, there is a difference." He looked at me. "I have been watching you be careful for 16 years, I said. "I have also been watching you be the opposite of cold in the ways that matter for the same length of time. The cold is a surface. The opposite of cold is what's underneath." He was quiet for a long time. "She is not afraid of me," he said finally. "No," I said. "Most people decide what they think of me very quickly," he said, "within the first meeting. They settle on something feared or respected or ridiculous or formidable, and they don't revise. She keeps— I can't tell what she thinks of me at any given moment. She keeps looking at me as if the question is still open." "That is because she is genuinely curious," I said, "and because she sees systems, as she said. She sees you as a system that has not yet revealed its full logic." He looked at me sharply. "She told me that," he said. "Not in those words," I said. "It is my inference from several conversations." He stood up. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking at the drive. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "You don't have to know how," I said. "You only have to be honest with her. She is someone to whom honesty is the appropriate approach. She will not thank you for management. She will thank you for truth." "She doesn't know," he said. "No," I said. "I believe she doesn't know. I also believe that she is making a considerable effort not to know." He turned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, "that she is a careful person and a principled one, and she is in your employment, and she is conducting herself accordingly. But she is not indifferent. That is my observation, and you may do with it what you will." He looked at me for a very long time. "She's not indifferent," he said, not as a question. "No," I said, "she is not." He left. He did not come back to the East Wing for 3 days, and when he did, he came with a copy of a new natural history text he had acquired in the county town, which he left in the catalog room with a brief note saying it might be useful for the survey. She read the note 3 times, which I know because she was in the catalog room when I came to retrieve a document from the adjacent shelf, and she was looking at the note with the particular expression she used when she was working something out. "Did he choose this himself?" she said without preamble. "I believe so," I said. She looked at the note again. Then she put it in the inside cover of the text, closed the cover over it, and opened the text to the table of contents. "Good," she said quietly to herself or to me or to no one. I went to find my document and did not say anything else, and thought, on the way back to my office, that the intelligence I had offered the Duke was correct, and that the situation was going to resolve itself in one direction or another very soon. There were, in May, before the Penthorne Assembly, a series of encounters that I will record here, because I believe they form the hidden scaffolding of what happened in July. The first was on a morning in the second week of May, when Miss Vane came to me with a question about the estate's tenancy agreements. Not a general question, a specific one. She had been reading the module she was preparing on practical estate management for Cecily, and she had found a point about the standard terms of the hall's agreements that she wanted to understand. The question was technically sound and showed that she had read the documents carefully. "You've been studying the tenancy files," I said. "I've been studying everything," she said. "It's a habit. I find that whatever you're doing, the context makes it better." "The tenancy agreements," I said, "are on the second shelf in the estate office. You've been in the estate files." She looked at me. "Should I not be?" "You're welcome there," I said, which was strictly speaking true. I had never restricted access. "It's simply, Mr. Pemberton. It isn't entirely for Cecily's curriculum, is it?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "No," she said, "not entirely." "You're learning the estate," I said. "I'm learning this place," she said. "It seems like the right thing to do." She said it simply, as she said most things, and moved on to her actual question, which I answered, and we did not pursue the rest of it. But I noted it. She was learning Caldermere the way she had learned the hall's rooms, by walking them. Systematically, attentively, with the intention of understanding it completely. And she was doing this at a point when she had no particular reason to need to understand it except that she lived in it, and it had the quality, to her, of something worth understanding fully. The second encounter was on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of May, 3 days before the Penthorne Assembly. The Duke had been to the east fence inspection. The fence repairs I had discussed with him in April had been completed, and he had gone to see them. And he had come back through the south garden, which was the route that brought him past the window of the schoolroom at the time when Cecily was at her Italian and Miss Vane was at the schoolroom desk. He had not come in, but the schoolroom window was open because the morning was warm, and from the courtyard below, which I know because I was crossing the courtyard on my way from the stables and I observed what happened, he stood for a moment and listened. Cecily was struggling with a particular construction that was giving her trouble, and Miss Vane was explaining it. She was explaining it the way she always explained difficult things, through the concrete, through the specific case, through the example that made the abstraction visible. She was patient but not slow. She gave Cecily exactly as much time as she needed and not a moment more. And she said at one point, in a particular tone that I had come to recognize as her fullest engagement, warm, precise, genuinely interested in the person she was talking to, "Try it again. You nearly had it. Your instinct was right." The Duke stood in the courtyard and listened for approximately 2 minutes. Then he walked around the side of the building and came in through the east door. I noted this too. The third encounter was the evening before the Penthorne Assembly. The Duke had come to the east wing. I was not certain why, as there was no specific reason for his being there, and found himself in the corridor at approximately the time that Miss Vane finished her customary evening walk and was returning to her rooms. She said good evening. He said good evening. They stood in the corridor for a moment. "Are you attending tomorrow?" he said. "With Lady Cecily, yes," she said, "if that's still the arrangement." "It is," he said, and then after a pause, "I have been considering whether I want to say before tomorrow that—" He stopped. He tried a different approach. "Lady Harriet will be there." "I know," she said. "She has a candidate she intends me to meet," he said. "Mrs. Ellsworth," she said. "Cecily mentioned her." He looked at her. "Does Cecily have an opinion?" "Cecily always has an opinion," she said. "Whether she shares it is a different matter." "What is it?" She was quiet for a moment. "Cecily thinks you've already made your choice," she said in a careful voice. "She's told me this. I don't know if that's something you intended her to communicate." The Duke was very still. "No," he said, "I didn't intend it." "But it's true," she said even more carefully. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment in the corridor, with the candles in the wall sconces making the light move a little, and she looked back at him with the look she sometimes had, the question still open, everything still possible. "Yes," he said, "it's true." She was very quiet. "I am not. I need some time," he said. There are things I need to arrange, things I want to be certain about before I say anything else." "All right," she said. "In the meantime," he said, "I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow with Lady Harriet, with Mrs. Ellsworth, has nothing to do with—" He stopped. "With this," she said. "With this," he agreed. She looked at him for a moment longer. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She paused. "Thank you." She went to her rooms. He stood in the corridor for a moment longer, and then he went back through the hall, and I, who had been in the alcove at the far end of the corridor with a candle and a document I had been ostensibly reading, sat very still until he was gone and then wrote in my mental notes, which later became the journal entry, everything I had just observed. That night I wrote, "He has told her," not quite directly, but she knows and he knows she knows, and tomorrow is going to be interesting. I believe I have given an adequate account of the Penthorne Assembly in my earlier narrative, but I want to add one detail that I omitted. At the end of the evening, when we had returned to Caldermere, and Cecily was in bed, and Miss Vane had gone to her rooms, and the Duke and I were in the estate office briefly reviewing the post that had accumulated. One of the few occasions in the year when I have been able to observe the Duke in the moments immediately after a significant social occasion without the mediation of the next day's account. He said, looking at the window rather than at me, "She was very good tonight." "Miss Vane," I said, though I knew. "She made that old man feel genuinely seen," he said. "He's been telling stories of the Oporto campaign for 40 years, and every man in the county has heard them twice, and she listened as if she was hearing them for the first time. But it wasn't performance. She was actually interested." "She is actually interested," I said, "in most things." "I know," he said. "That's what He stopped. He looked at the window for another moment. "It's the rarest thing," he said, "to be genuinely curious, to not be pretending." "Yes," I said. "Most people pretend," he said. "They decide in advance what they're interested in and then find it. She goes in the other direction. She finds what's there first and then decides how to be interested in it." "A naturalist's approach," I said. He looked at me. There was the jaw shift. "Yes," he said, "a naturalist's approach." He took his post and went to the library, and I went to my office, and I wrote all of it down. The month between the Penthorne Assembly and the events of July contained, among other things, a succession of small moments that I now see as the ground preparation for what happened in the catalogue room. They were, individually, nothing remarkable. Together they were a structure. There was the morning he came to the schoolroom specifically to tell Cecily that the retired captain was coming for tea and that she should prepare her astronomy notebooks. He came in person rather than by note. He stayed for 3 minutes. He spoke to Cecily. He looked at Miss Vane once briefly with a look that was not the armored look and not the open look of April, something between, the look of a man who knows something and is working on how to say it. There was the afternoon she found the essay by the Oxford scholar about the Thucydides translation and read it, and then wrote a response, not a letter to the scholar, but a private response, working out her own argument. She mentioned this to me because she had used the catalogue room's table for the writing and left her notes behind and came back for them and found I had been in the room and was, perhaps, aware of what was on the table. "I write my way through arguments," she said. "It's a habit from studying with my father." "The essay was useful then," I said. "He was right about the third passage," she said. "I didn't want to admit it, but he was right." I said carefully. She looked at me with the look she used when she suspected I was being deliberately slow. "The Oxford scholar," she said, though the Duke's argument about the second passage was also correct, which I found more annoying. "You could tell him," I said. She thought about this. "He already knows he was right," she said. "He doesn't need me to confirm it." "He might still like to hear it," I said. She was quiet then. "Yes," she said, "I suppose he might." She wrote him a note. He responded. I do not know what either note said, but I know the response note arrived from the library within the hour, which was fast even for the Duke when he was motivated. And I know that the next morning Miss Vane was in the catalogue room when the Duke came to return a book to the library, and they talked for 40 minutes, and at the end of the 40 minutes, she looked considerably more settled than she had at the beginning, as if something that had been slightly misaligned had been corrected. There was the evening in June when she stayed late in the East Wing and the lights were still on in the catalogue room when the rest of the household was dark, and the Duke, returning from the stables, saw the light from the courtyard and came inside. He had told me this the next morning without explicit detail, but I understood from the general shape of what he said that they had spent an hour in the catalogue room talking about something that was not catalogues, and that he had come away from it feeling, as he put it, considerably more clear-headed than I have been in some time. "About," I said. "Various things," he said. I nodded. I noted it. There was the matter of the garden survey for the beetles. which she had been conducting in her own hours, and which the Duke had offered to accompany her on one evening in late June, not as the Duke of Caldermere escorting a member of his household, but as someone who knew the North Field and wanted to see what she found there. They had spent 2 hours in the North Field on a warm June evening with notebooks and a lamp when the light went, and had found 3 specimens of the variety she was tracking, and had a conversation about substrate that I know was about beetles, but that I suspected was also about other things entirely. She came back from that evening changed in some small and fundamental way, not larger or louder, but somehow more fully present, as if something that had been slightly withheld was no longer being withheld. She came to my office the next morning to tell me about the beetle findings, and I listened and said the appropriate things and looked at her face and thought, "It is resolved." Not declared, not yet, but resolved in the part of a person that knows things before the mind has organized them into words. Caro, I have not given him the full account he deserves, which is to say I have not fully described the damage his campaign caused, because I wanted to move toward the resolution, which is the better part of the story. But the damage was real, and I want to be accurate. The insinuation, as I have said, was impossible to refute directly, because it offered nothing concrete to refute. It was the kind of slander that works by accumulation. No single instance of it is significant, but in the aggregate it produces a particular fog around a person that makes others uncertain how to situate them. It makes people ask questions that would not otherwise occur to them. It makes rooms shift slightly when the person enters. Miss Vane felt this, though she did not tell me directly. She told me when I first mentioned Mrs. Hathaway's inquiries that she had noticed a slight change in the temperature of certain rooms since the May assembly. That was how she described it, a change in temperature. I understood what she meant. The county's social rooms, drawing rooms, assembly rooms had cooled by a degree or 2 when she entered, in a way that was imperceptible unless you were the one entering. She had not told the Duke. I understood why. She was not going to come to him with a problem that she could not substantiate, that would require him to take her word against the county's social temperature, and that would, she was careful about this, put him in a position of defending her. She was not going to arrange to need his protection. That was not how she operated. But I had watched her, through June and into July, absorbing the temperature shift with the same contained steadiness she brought to everything difficult, and I was aware of what it was costing her, and I was glad when the Duke moved when he did, because I do not think she would have spoken, and I think the cost of not speaking was becoming heavier than it looked. When I brought the intelligence to the Duke, the Caro connection, the Northamptonshire letter, the full shape of what had been said, and where his response was immediate and physical in a way I had rarely seen from him. He was very still for a moment, and then he stood up, and the posture he assumed was the full-height posture I have mentioned, the one that means a decision has been made. "How long has she been managing this alone?" he said. "Since May," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "She didn't tell me." "No," I said. "She wouldn't," he said. "She wouldn't come to me with—" He stopped. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way he did when he was angry with himself about something. "I should have been paying attention to the county's temperature, not just to the estate." "You could not have known," I said. "The reports don't come to you through the usual channels." "They come through you," he said. "Yes," I said. "I should have been watching sooner. The fault is shared." He looked at me. The anger was still there, but directed mostly inward. "It's not shared," he said. "It is mine. I have let a situation exist in my household that I should have resolved months ago." He meant the Caro situation, and he meant the other situation too, the one that was not yet resolved, that had been building since October, that he had been careful about in a way that, he had clearly decided, had been careful to a fault. He went to find Cecily first, as I have recorded, and then to the catalogue room. What I did not include in my earlier account, because it was not visible to me from the corridor, and I have it only from Miss Vane's own account, given to me 3 days after it happened, is what was said between them after the moment where he took her hand. He had said, "I want to do this properly." She had said, with a slight smile, something about 9 months. And then she had said, "You should know that I don't expect anything to be simple. I know who you are. I know what Caldermere requires of you. I know that I am not the obvious choice." He had looked at her for a moment. "You are," he had said, "the only choice. That is the very specific nature of the problem and the very specific nature of the solution." She had looked at him. "I don't want a duchess," he had said. I want the particular person who walks the hall at 4:30 in the afternoon because she wants to know its shape. I want the person who kept a box of beetles for 9 years. I want the person who argues with translations and is patient with 12-year-olds and who looks at the river at night and says it's conducive to sleep. I have spent 9 months wanting you specifically, which is entirely inconvenient and entirely final, and I would very much like to stop managing it and simply say it." She had been very quiet. "I think you've said it," she said. "I have," he said. "Was it adequate?" She had looked at him with the look that was all the things behind the careful control, and she had said, "It was more than adequate. It was," she stopped. "It was you." "That's what made it adequate." He had held her hand very carefully. "May I?" he had said. "Yes," she had said before he finished. And so he had, there in the catalog room, amid the old catalogs and the smell of good paper, kissed her very carefully once, and held her hand afterward as if putting it down was not something he intended to do. "I'm going to London," he had said. "I know," she had said. "I'll be quick about it," he had said. "Good," she had said. And she had looked at him with the open look, the same one, I thought when she described it, as the one I had seen through the corridor window in April, and he had looked back at her with the open face, and neither of them had needed to say anything else. I want to record also what Cecily said to me in the week between the catalogue room and the Duke's return from London. She came to my office on the Wednesday of that week, not with a note but in person, which was unusual for mid-afternoon. She was generally in lessons until 4. "Miss Vane gave me the afternoon," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the air of someone who has something to discuss and intends to discuss it properly. "Did she?" I said. "She said I had been working very hard and she wanted me to have some time," Cecily said, which was kind, but I think also she needed the afternoon herself. "Probably," I said. "Pemberton," Cecily said, in the tone that meant she was going to say something direct. "Lady Cecily." "When he comes back," she said, "and when it's properly arranged, I want her to be the Duchess, not just his wife, the actual Duchess. I want her to know the estate. I want her to have the same access to everything as he does." I looked at her. "That will be for them to arrange," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm just telling you what I want, because you write everything down and I want it on record." "On record," I said. "Yes," she said, "for the journal." I looked at her for a moment. "You know about the journal." "I've known about the journal for years," she said, with the serenity of someone who has been keeping this information to themselves for some time and has chosen this moment to stop. "I found it when I was 9. I was not supposed to be in your office, but I was 9 and the lock was very simple. I absorbed this. I didn't read most of it," she said. "Only the parts about me, and the parts about Edward, and the parts about the governesses, and the parts about the boundary dispute which were quite interesting." "The lock," I said, "has since been replaced." "I know," she said. "Much harder. I tried last October." I looked at her. "She was very interesting from the first day," Cecily said. "I could tell from the pudding." "You could tell from the pudding," I said. "She noticed the quality of it and said thank you to Dot specifically, not to the room," Cecily said. "Most people don't say thank you to Dot. They say thank you to the meal. But she said thank you to Dot and asked her name and said she had an excellent sense of what was appropriate." She paused. "That's a person who sees people," she said. "People who see people are the most interesting kind." I sat for a moment with this. "You are," I said finally, "an extraordinary person." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I know," she said. "Edward says it's because I'm the child of their old age and they put everything into me." "That may be part of it," I said. "The other part," she said, "is Miss Vane." She said it simply, factually, as a statement of observed reality. "She's the best teacher I've ever had. She sees what I can do before I know I can do it. She points at things and I suddenly find I know how to look at them. I don't think that's a common thing." "No," I said, "I don't think it is." "I want her to stay," Cecily said. "I know it's more complicated than that, but that's what I want." "I know," I said. "I believe you will have it." She looked at me. "You're sure?" "I am," I said. She nodded once precisely with the satisfaction of someone who has had a question answered and is now ready to move on to the next thing. She stood up. "I'm going to continue with my Italian," she said. "I want to have it properly finished before he comes back." She left. I sat for a moment in my office and thought about all the things she had said, and then I opened the journal and wrote. She knew in November. She knew from the pudding. The wedding, which I have already described, was on a Saturday in the second week of October, almost exactly 1 year from Miss Vane's arrival at the hall. This was not, I am fairly certain, an accident. The Duchess chose the date, and she is the kind of woman who notices these things. After the ceremony, in the carriage back to the hall, Cecily, who had managed, through approximately 20 minutes of the service, to maintain the composure of a young woman at a formal occasion before collapsing quietly into weeping and producing a handkerchief that she had clearly prepared in advance, sat beside me, and said, in a voice that was still somewhat recovered, "It's done." "It is," I said. "It took about as long as I expected," she said. I thought about the timeline. "You expected it would take a year," I said. "I expected it would take until he stopped managing himself," she said. "And I didn't think that would be quick. He's been managing for a long time. It takes time to unlearn." "You were very strategic," I said. She looked at me with the eyes that were her brother's eyes, precise and direct. "I was," she said. "I am not sorry about it." "I didn't think you were." "I do things for reasons," she said. "The astronomy module was about astronomy, genuinely, but it was also," she paused. "I wanted him to see her properly. He was always in his own part of the house. I had to get them into the same parts of the house." "The telescope," I said. "The telescope, the natural history module, the maps, the catalog room." He goes to the catalog room, she goes to the catalog room, they're in the same part of the house at the same time, and eventually they talk. It's not complicated. "It is," I said, "quite a complex operation for a 12-year-old. "I'm 13 now," she said with considerable dignity. "So you are," I said. She looked out the window at the October countryside going past. "Do you think she's happy?" she said. I thought about the Duchess, about Alara Vane, who had arrived on a rainy Wednesday from the York coach in a dress the color of wet slate, who had looked at the hall and said, "Oh," and who had spent a year building her knowledge of it quietly and thoroughly, and who had stood in the village church that morning with her hand in the Duke's and her face entirely unguarded. "Yes," I said, "I think she's happy." "Good," Cecily said, and leaned against the carriage window and let the countryside go past. "One more thing. In the first week of November of the year following the wedding, I was in the south garden in the late afternoon, checking on a planting that had been made to the east border, a practical matter, when I heard voices from the east tower room above. The window was open. The Duke and the Duchess were in the East Tower room, which had become a regular gathering place for all three of them. Cecily was not there. She was, I believe, at her music lesson in the village. They were talking. I could not hear exactly what they were saying, only the tone of it, which was the tone I had heard from the library door in the evenings. Easy, various, without the quality of managed performance, without the armor. And then the Duke's actual laugh, the real one, the one I had heard perhaps 4 times in 16 years. I stood in the south garden for a moment and listened. It was a cold November afternoon, and the garden was brown and silver, and the river, which I could hear from the south side, was making its autumn sound, and the laugh from the tower room was real, and everything else that was real along with it. I went back to my work. I wrote it down. I have said that I will go back, and there is more to go back to. I have described the large events, the Penthorne Assembly, the matter of Caro, the catalogue room, the wedding. But the large events are only the visible portion of the year, and what I keep returning to in the journal and in my own recollection are the small ones. The ones that did not seem, at the time, to matter particularly. The ones that I almost did not write down. Let me write them down now. In the first days of December, when the hall had taken on its winter arrangements, and the fires were burning earlier each afternoon, and the kitchen smelled of the slow-cooked dishes the Duke preferred, there was an afternoon when the hall's boiler, which heated the east wing through a system of pipes that had been installed by the 4th Duke, and that functioned with the reliability of something very old that has not been properly attended to for several decades, made a decision to stop functioning. It chose a Tuesday afternoon at 2:30, when the temperature outside had dropped to a level I found unpleasant, and the East Wing schoolroom, which had the worst insulation in the hall owing to a combination of old window frames and a position that caught the north wind directly, was correspondingly cold. I became aware of the problem when Dot came to my office to tell me that Lady Cecily and Miss Vane were continuing lessons with their coats on, and Miss Vane had told Dot that the situation was perfectly manageable, but that Dot should mention it to me in case it was helpful. I went to find the boiler man. The boiler man was not available until the following morning. I sent for additional heating irons and had them installed in the schoolroom at speed, which produced a situation that was adequate but not warm. When I came to check on the schoolroom at 4 o'clock, the Duke was there. He had apparently become aware of the boiler situation through the specific channel of finding the east corridor colder than usual on his way to the library and asking the nearest housemaid what had happened. The housemaid had told him about the boiler, and he had gone to the schoolroom directly. He found Cecily and Miss Vane both in their coats, working at the table in what was, with the heating irons, a reasonable approximation of a bearable temperature. He looked at the arrangements, looked at the coats, looked at the heating irons, and said to me when I arrived, "Move the lessons to the library." "The library?" I said. "It's warm," he said. "Move them." So the schoolroom decamped to the library for the remainder of the afternoon, which produced the specific experience of Cecily doing her Italian conjugations at the library table while surrounded by several thousand books that she was not yet formally allowed to access, and Miss Vane conducting the lesson from the other end of the table while the Duke continued with his own work at his desk on the far side of the room. This arrangement, two women doing lessons at one end of the library and the Duke of Caldermere working at his desk at the other end, was, by any standard, unusual. The Duke appeared not to find it unusual at all. He worked. They worked. At one point, Cecily asked Miss Vane a question about Italian subjunctive mood, and Miss Vane answered, and the Duke, without looking up from his papers, said the imperfect subjunctive particularly in the epistolary form, and both Cecily and Miss Vane looked at him, and he continued to read his papers. "You speak Italian?" Cecily said. "Some," the Duke said. "How much is some?" Cecily said. "Enough to read most documents and converse on straightforward subjects," he said. Cecily looked at Miss Vane. Miss Vane looked at Cecily. "Could you help with the irregular forms?" Cecily said. The Duke set down his pen. He came to the library table. He spent 20 minutes on the irregular forms, and while he did it, he and Miss Vane traded teaching approaches in the efficient manner of two people who find each other easy to work with. And at the end of it, Cecily could conjugate the subjunctive imperfect in 12 of its most common irregular forms without prompting. The boiler was fixed the next morning. The lessons returned to the schoolroom. But I noted what had happened in the library, and when the Duke came past my office that evening with a letter he needed franked, he paused in the doorway for a moment and said, not quite looking at me, "She teaches well." "She does," I said. "She doesn't talk down to Cecily," he said. "She talks alongside her. As if she's genuinely interested in what Cecily is going to do with the material, not just whether she's gotten the material right." "That's an accurate description," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I taught myself," he said. "After my father died, I had tutors, but I was past the point of being teachable by someone who was frightened of me." He looked at the corridor. "I wonder sometimes what it would have been to have someone who talked alongside me." He took his letter and left. I sat for a long time with that. In January, after Lady Harriet's visit and the departure of Miss Portmore, there was a period of about 2 weeks in which the hall was quieter than usual. Lady Harriet's presence had introduced a level of social energy that, while managed, had used a certain amount of the household's reserves, and the departure of that energy left something that was not quite emptiness, but was the specific quality of a house finding its own level again. In this period, Miss Vane and the Duke encountered each other several times in circumstances that I think contributed to what I think of as the January shift, the moment when the careful management the Duke had been applying since December became, visibly, somewhat harder to maintain. The first encounter was on a Monday in the 3rd week of January. The Duke had come to the East Wing for no stated purpose, which by January was no longer unusual, and found Miss Vane in the corridor window seat with a stack of papers she was grading. She looked up when he came past. He stopped. "What is it?" he said. "An essay on the trade routes of the medieval Mediterranean," she said. "Cecily's first extended essay, 12 pages. He looked at the stack. 12 pages. "She's thorough," Miss Vane said. "The argument is good. The structure needs work, but the argument is genuinely good." He leaned against the wall across from the window seat, in a posture that was more casual than I was accustomed to seeing from him in the company of anyone who was not myself or Cecily. "What's the argument?" "That the emphasis on spice routes as the primary driver of medieval Mediterranean trade understates the importance of textile routes," she said. "Which is not an original argument, the scholarly literature has it, but she arrived at it independently, through the logistics analysis I had her do as a foundation. She didn't know it was an existing argument. She just found it." He was quiet for a moment. "She found it herself." "Yes," Miss Vane said. He looked at the window, at the gray January garden outside. "When I was 12, he said, I found a discrepancy in my father's estate accounts that nobody had noticed. A structural issue in the way the timber sales were recorded that had been compounding for 11 years. I brought it to my father's steward of the time, and he said, 'That's very good, Master Edward,' and did not explain what it meant or what was going to be done about it." He paused. "I wish someone had said, 'Yes, you found something real, and here's how to think about what to do with it.'" She was looking at him. "What did you do?" "I tracked it myself," he said, "for 3 years until I was old enough to bring it to the man of business. By that time I had a full picture of it, and I dealt with it." He looked at the garden. "I learned by necessity. It's not the best method." "No," she said, "but it produced what you have." He looked at her. "What I have," he said. "The precision," she said, "the thoroughness. The way you see the estate as a system of obligations and relationships and not just a set of assets." She said it simply, the way she said most true things. "That's learned. That's not accident." He was quiet. "How do you know that about the way I see the estate?" he said. "I've been reading the tenancy files," she said. "Your letters to the tenants, the terms you offer." She paused. "The Warrington family on the North Field, your letter when they had the bad autumn 3 seasons ago. That's not how most landlords write to their tenants." He was very still. "You've read the tenancy letters." "The files are in the estate office and I had access," she said. "I hope I wasn't prying. I was understanding the place." "Understanding the place," he said. "You said in October that the hall was well ordered," she said. "It is, but the order it's ethical. It's not just efficient. Someone made choices about what kind of order to build, and those choices show in how everything is managed. I wanted to understand the choices." He looked at her for a long time. The corridor was very quiet. The gray January light came through the window onto the pile of Cecily's S. "No one has ever described it that way," he said. "I imagine not," she said. "Most people look at an estate and see land and income. You have to look at the documents to see the choices." He was quiet again. Then, "You are, Miss Vane, a very unusual person." She seemed genuinely surprised by this, as she had been in October when he had said she was not modest enough. "I'm reasonably ordinary," she said. "No," he said, "you're not." He said it with a finality that closed the topic, and then he looked at the essay. "May I?" She gave him the top pages. He read them in the corridor, standing against the wall in the January light. When he had finished, he handed them back. "The argument is good," he said. "You're right about the structure." "I know," she said. "She'll improve it." He nodded. He looked at her one more moment. The look, which was becoming by January the look that gave the most away about what he was managing, and then he went to the library. She sat for a moment with the essay in her hands. Then she continued grading. "In February, a month I have described primarily in terms of the beetle box and the library, but which contained a great deal else. There was a specific evening that I want to record because it is, I think, the evening when the hall finally felt fully inhabited again. It was a Thursday, and there had been snow during the day, not deep snow, but the kind of thin snow that settles on the gardens and makes them bright in the early dark. Cecily had spent the afternoon watching the snow with the intensity she brought to meteorological events, making observations in her notebook. Miss Vane had given her the afternoon to observe freely. what she called a free observation period, which was not free at all but was the kind of structured freedom that produces more than the structured work. After supper, Cecily had come to the drawing room, the smaller Eastern drawing room that the household used in winter, which was warmer than the large, formal drawing room and had a fire that burned reliably, and had announced that she wanted to read aloud. This was an Ashbourne family tradition that predated my time at the Hall and that had, since Charlotte's death, been somewhat intermittent. Cecily had revived it the previous autumn, and on some evenings she read to the assembled household in a manner that suggested she was not simply reading, but performing a service she considered important. The Duke was in the drawing room. Miss Vane was in the drawing room. I was in the drawing room, because I sometimes was on Thursday evenings when the household accounts did not demand my presence elsewhere. Cecily read from a novel she had been working through for 2 weeks, a historical novel set during the time of the Crusades, which had been selected for the obvious connection to her medieval studies, but which had turned out to be a considerably better novel than its educational function would have suggested necessary. She read well. She had always read well, since early childhood, with an instinct for pace and character that made listening to her easy. She read for 40 minutes. At the end of the passage she had chosen, she closed the book. "That's the best part," she said. "I don't want to go past it tonight." "Wise," Miss Vane said. "What's the best part?" the Duke asked. He was in his usual chair, the high-backed chair near the fire that no one else sat in and that had his shape in it by now. He was holding his coffee. "Where she realizes he's been protecting her from the beginning," Cecily said. "Not dramatically, just in all the small ways. The reader can see it building across 200 pages and then it's visible all at once." The Duke looked at his coffee. "It's a good technique," Miss Vane said. "The accumulation, the small things that become one large thing." "Yes," Cecily said. She looked at her brother. "Edward, did you know that snowflakes all have 6 sides?" "Yes," he said, accepting the change of subject with the equanimity he had developed for Cecily's topic changes, which were rarely as random as they appeared. "Miss Vane says it's to do with the molecular structure of water," Cecily said, "which suggests that there's a kind of inevitability built into things at a very small scale, like they can't help but make the shape they make." "That's a fair interpretation of crystallography," Miss Vane said. "Can't help but make the shape they make," the Duke said, mostly to himself. Cecily nodded, satisfied. "I thought that was interesting," she said. "As a principle." She put the book on the side table and said good night. It was 9:10, which was the limit of her permitted evening, and went upstairs. The Duke and Miss Vane and I remained by the fire for a moment in the drawing room. The Duke said, to the fire rather than to anyone, 12 years old and thinking about crystallography as a principle. 13 now, I said. Since when? He said, with the sharp look of a man who has just been reminded of something he should not have needed reminding of. Her birthday is in February, I said, the 8th. He looked at me with the expression he used when he was annoyed at himself. Tomorrow, Miss Vane said gently. He put down his coffee, he stood up. He went to the door and paused. He said without turning, Pemberton, the cook, the yellow cake with the lemon icing, it's what she always has. I've already arranged it, I said. He nodded, he said good night and left. Miss Vane looked at me. He forgot, she said. He forgets every year, I said. He always remembers the day before. The cook has standing instructions. She was quiet for a moment. Then, he feels things very deeply, she said, and he doesn't always know where to put them. No, I said, he doesn't. She looked at the fire. I don't know what to do with people who feel things very deeply, she said. I'm not sure I'm qualified. With respect, I said, I think you're exactly qualified. I think it's a specific qualification, not a general one. She looked at me. You say things like that, and then look completely innocent about them. I have been cultivating that skill for 31 years, I said. She laughed, the quiet, genuine laugh she produced when something caught her off guard. It was a good sound. Caldermere had not had enough of it in the years before her arrival. Good night, Mr. Pemberton, she said. Good night, Miss Vane, I said. I want to record the birthday, too. Cecily's 13th birthday was on a Friday in the first week of February. The Duke was in his study when she came down to breakfast, and when she arrived in the doorway, he was there already. He had come from his study specifically, which meant he had set aside the morning's work, and he said happy birthday and gave her a book he had ordered from London, a natural history text newly issued on British beetles. Cecily looked at the book. She looked at her brother. "Thank you," she said, with the precision of someone who has received exactly the right thing. "Miss Vane said you'd been extending the survey," he said. Cecily turned the book over in her hands. "How did you know which one to get?" "I asked Miss Vane," he said. There was a pause. "Did she choose it?" Cecily said. "She identified 3 possible options," he said. "I chose." Cecily nodded slowly, with the expression she used when she was processing something that had several layers to it. "That was a good system," she said. "Yes," he said. "Very collaborative," she said. "Have your breakfast," he said. She sat down and had her breakfast and said nothing more about it. But when I came to clear the sideboard, she gave me a look that was the small horse drawing an expression form, satisfied, pleased, barely suppressing itself. Miss Vane had given Cecily, for her birthday, a blank notebook with a particular kind of paper in it. Thick, cream-colored with a texture that she had described. When she gave it, as suitable for natural history drawings and for any other kind of thinking that needed good paper under it. She had written on the first page only, for the things you find that haven't been named yet. Cecily had read this and held the notebook for a moment and then said, "This is exactly right," and Miss Vane had looked at her with the full presence look and said, "I know." The birthday cake was yellow with lemon icing, as it always was. The cook had outdone herself. Cecily pronounced it perfect. The Duke, who did not eat sweet things as a general rule, had a slice and said it was very good, and Cook looked as though she had received a letter from the sovereign. It was a good birthday. The hall had had good birthdays in its time, but this one had a particular quality, the quality of a household that is becoming a family, or returning to one, or discovering that it has been one all along without knowing how to say it. There is one more conversation I want to record, one that I have kept until now because it is the most intimate of the ones I was witness to, and I have been uncertain whether to set it down. I have decided to set it down because it is the truest account I have of what the year produced, and because the journal is for truth and not for decorum. It was in the 3rd week of June, on the evening of the Northfield Beetle survey. I have said that they came back from the survey changed, that she came back more fully present, and that I understood the situation to be resolved at some fundamental level before the words were found for it. What I did not describe is what I know of the conversation that took place in the Northfield, which Miss Vane told me about in the same session when she told me about the catalog room. She said they had found the 3rd specimen of the variety she was tracking, and the Duke had crouched beside it in the long grass with the lamp while she made her notes, and they had been quiet for a while with the Northfield around them and the hall visible at the top of the rise. He had said, without looking at her, "I have been trying to think of how to say something for some months now." "I know," she had said. "You know," he had said. "I've been waiting," she had said. "I wasn't sure. I didn't know if it was what I thought it was, or if I was, I have some experience of hoping things are what they appear to be and finding out later they were more complicated." "What happened?" he had said. She had been quiet for a moment. "A family I was employed by when I was younger," she said. "I thought the son of the house was, I thought there was something real there. There wasn't. There was something from his side, but it wasn't something that was going to go anywhere for reasons that were entirely to do with position and family expectation, and I understood that, eventually, but it cost me something to understand it. I was more careful after." He had been very still. "That's why I didn't," she had paused. "That's why I have been careful about what I allowed myself to think." "I am not," he had said with a quietness that had taken, she thought, a great deal of effort to keep quiet, "going to be complicated in that way. I want to be very clear about that." "I know," she had said. "How do you know?" "Because you are the kind of person who knows what he wants and doesn't manage it once he's decided," she had said. "You manage yourself. You don't manage your intentions." He had looked at her then. "Is that, how do you know that about me?" "The tenancy letters," she had said. "And the way you are with Cecily, and the way you were with me from the beginning when you were being careful, you were genuinely careful, not you weren't being something you didn't feel." You felt something and you didn't know what to do with it. That's different from not feeling it. He had been silent for a long time. I want to be able to say, he had said, the specific thing I feel. I have not been in the habit of being specific about feelings. The habit has been the opposite. I know, she had said. What I feel, he had said, is that you are the person I have spent 9 years not knowing I was waiting to be with, and that I would like to spend the next portion of time, however much is available, in a situation where being with you is the condition and not the exception. She had looked at him for a long time. That's specific, she had said finally. Yes, he had said. I don't need you to be different, she had said quietly. I need you to be what you already are, specifically you. He had looked at her. The lamp was between them, and the north field was around them, and the hall was visible at the top of the rise. What I already am, he had said, is occasionally impossible. I know, she had said. I've been living in your house for 9 months. I have a thorough inventory of what you are, including the difficult parts. I'm not concerned by them. You're not concerned by them, he had said. No, she had said, because you're not concerned by mine, and I have difficult parts too. He had said, name one. She had said, I keep beetles under my bed. He had looked at her, and the actual laugh had appeared, the real one, the one I had heard perhaps 4 times in 16 years. And she had looked at him laughing, and her face had opened entirely. And in the north field, with the lamp between them and the hall at the top of the rise, the year had resolved itself into what it had always been going to be. Still specific, she had said. Entirely, he had said. This is what I have to record. A year, 14 engines of story, and this one is the one that fitted, the meddler who saw it first, which in this case was a 12-year-old girl with a horse for a signature, who knew from the pudding and managed from November. The man who spent a year refusing everything the world offered him because the thing he wanted was already in his house, teaching his sister to read. The woman who kept a box of beetles under her bed and walked the hall every afternoon because she wanted to know its shape. The shape it turned out to have was this, the place where she belonged. I am aware that this is the kind of ending that sounds like something out of a novel. I am aware that I am a steward who has been keeping a journal for 31 years, and that perhaps the decades of observation have given me a tendency to find patterns that are tidier than the reality. But the reality in this case was tidy. It had the tidiness of things that take a long time to arrive, but that, when they arrive, fit with the precision of something that was always going to fit. The way a key fits a lock that was made for it, not made by it. Cecily would have something to say about the molecular structure of that metaphor. She would point out that it implies a predetermination that the year's events did not actually have, that any number of things could have intervened, that the outcome was not inevitable but contingent, that what made it work was not the structure but the choices made within it. She would be right, she usually is. But from where I stood 6 feet behind the Duke, 2 steps to the left, with eyes that he often forgot were there, what I saw was not predetermination. What I saw was this: 2 people, each carrying something they needed to set down, finding each other in the rooms of an old house, in corridors and catalog rooms and north fields, and setting it down slowly and then all at once. And a house which had been very well maintained, becoming fully alive. That is the year. That is what the 12 refusals were for, and what the one choice was. I close the journal. I open it again. I write, the river sounds excellent tonight. They have the east window open. That is all. But I have not told you about the autumn, and the autumn matters. After the wedding, after the October Saturday with Cecily's hat and the candles in the village church, there was a period of adjustment that I think is worth describing, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the opposite of dramatic, and the opposite of dramatic is often the truest part. The hall adjusted to having its duchess, and the adjustment was so natural and so rapid that within 3 weeks there was no memory of the hall without her. She had not made any sweeping changes. She had made small ones, continuously, in the manner of a person who sees what is actually in front of them rather than what they have decided to see, and who makes the response that the actual situation requires rather than the response that has always been made. The morning correspondence, as I have mentioned, the kitchen arrangements, a practical reorganization of the East Wing linen storage that had been impractical for approximately 20 years, and that she identified as impractical within a week of having access to it as Duchess, and resolved by moving 2 shelves, which produced in the housekeeper, Mrs. Treadwell. An expression of wonder at the simplicity of the solution, combined with the somewhat complicated feelings of a woman who has lived with a bad arrangement for 20 years, and is now confronting evidence that it did not have to be that way. She asked Mrs. Treadwell about the linen, whether there were other arrangements in the hall that had similarly settled into their problems without anyone addressing them. Mrs. Treadwell thought about this. Then she took the Duchess on a tour of the hall that lasted 4 hours and covered approximately 30 such arrangements, ranging from the genuinely pressing to the historically interesting. And at the end of it, the Duchess had a list and had already begun to address the top 6. I was informed of this by Mrs. Treadwell, who came to my office looking somewhat dazed. "She asks very good questions," Mrs. Treadwell said. "She does," I agreed. "She listens to the answers," Mrs. Treadwell said. "She does that too," I said. "The silver polish arrangement," Mrs. Treadwell said. 40 years, Mr. Pemberton, 40 years it's been done the wrong way." "I know," I said. "She fixed it in 20 minutes." "Yes," I said. Mrs. Treadwell looked at me. "She's very good," she said. "I know," I said. "We should have had her years ago," Mrs. Treadwell said. I thought about what to say to this. I said, "We have her now." Mrs. Treadwell nodded, with the expression of someone who has decided that this is sufficient, and went back to the linen room. The Duke, in the months after the wedding, was not visibly different from the Duke before it, which is to say, he was not a man transformed in any sudden theatrical way. He was still the man who was called cold by people who did not know him, and who was known to be thorough and unsmiling and possessed of standards that nobody entirely met. He still made the decisions of the estate with the same precision and the same attention to the system of obligations and relationships that she had identified in his tenancy letters. He still sat in the high-backed chair by the fire in the eastern drawing-room. But the small things were different. He did not need to manage himself in her company. This is the thing I noticed most, that the containing quality, the deliberateness, the care with which he had been operating his own emotional system in the months before July was simply gone, not replaced by anything ostentatious. Just gone, the way a piece of equipment you have been using to hold something up is no longer needed when the thing finds its own support. He laughed more. The actual laugh, the real one, not the jaw shift, which I had heard perhaps 4 or 5 times in 16 years, began appearing once a week, once every several days, in the evenings in the drawing room or in the library or in the East Tower room. It appeared in situations that were often small and domestic and entirely unspectacular. Something Cecily had said, something the Duchess had said, something she was doing with the natural history specimens that struck him as funny in the way that genuine domestic scenes are funny when you are fully present to them. He talked more too, not to more people. He had never been a man who wished to talk to more people, but at greater depth, and with less of the economy of manner that most people experienced as curtness. The economy was still there. He was not a man who used words he did not need. But there was now, in the words he did use, a quality of intention, a specificity, a willingness to say the actual thing rather than the adjacent thing that had not been as present before. I noted this. He had said to her in the North Field that he was trying to name the specific thing he felt, and he had been trying ever since, and the trying had become a habit, and the habit had become the way he spoke. Cecily, in the months after the wedding, flourished in a way that I had expected, but that was nonetheless remarkable to observe. She had always been extraordinary. What the autumn and winter of her 13th year produced in her was not a new quality, but a deepening of existing ones. The curiosity going wider, the precision going sharper, the emotional intelligence going more thoughtful and less instinctive, as it does when a child moves from intuition into understanding. Her relationship with the Duchess was different after the wedding from what it had been before it. Before, there had been the structure of the lesson, Miss Vane on one side of the table and Cecily on the other, the curriculum as the formal arrangement of their being together. After, the structure was still there, but the wider relationship was larger than the structure and operated around it in the way that the real relationship between two people always operates around the formal one, when the formal one becomes insufficient to contain what actually exists. They argued regularly and productively. Cecily's mind had developed enough by 13 to give the Duchess a genuine argument on many topics, and the Duchess engaged with these arguments with the full seriousness she gave to any argument that deserved it, which meant that Cecily was regularly in the experience of being taken completely seriously by someone whose intellectual standards she could not meet easily, and could therefore always aspire to. This, as the Duke had noted about the question of asking the next question, is one of the most valuable things that can be given to a person, to be taken seriously by someone whose seriousness means something. Cecily was, by the end of that autumn, beginning to take herself seriously in a particular way, not in the way of arrogance, which she had never had, but in the way of someone who is beginning to understand what they are capable of, and to treat that understanding as an obligation rather than a comfort. She was beginning to see the difference between being extraordinary and doing extraordinary things, and to sense that the second required more of her than the first. The Duchess saw this. She calibrated the curriculum accordingly, which meant that Cecily's lessons became, in November and December, more demanding in the specific direction of requiring her to do things rather than know them. The essays were longer. The arguments were tested more rigorously. The natural history project moved from collection and description to genuine analysis. Cecily was required to produce, by the end of the year, a survey of the Caldermere Estate's Northfield beetle population that was accurate enough and comprehensive enough to be the basis for any future survey. It was excellent work. The Duchess told her so in terms that were specific and thoughtful, and that I know from Cecily's account of the exchange, which she gave me with the particular pleasure of someone who has received a judgment they worked very hard to earn. There is one thing I want to say about the year that I have not yet said, because it does not fit neatly into any specific event, and requires a kind of standing back that the narrative itself does not always allow. The year I have been describing, the year of the 12 refusals and the one choice, was, for everyone in it, a year of becoming more fully what they already were. The Duke became more fully a man who knew what he valued and could say it. Not different from who he had been, the same man, the same code, the same precision and authority, but more present to himself. Less defended, still careful, but careful in the way of someone who is protecting something living rather than something that has stopped needing protection. Miss Vane, the Duchess, became more fully herself in a different way. She had been herself throughout, with the thoroughness and the principles and the beetles and the patience and the genuine curiosity. What she became, at Caldermere, was more fully situated. She found the place where the version of herself that she had been managing into available circumstances could simply exist, because the circumstances had become adequate to her. Cecily became, in the course of the year, the beginning of who she was going to be. That is a different thing from who she was at 12, and it is not possible to say yet, standing here at the end of the year, what the full shape of it will be. But the ground is good. The ground is exceptionally good. And I became, in the course of the year, a chronicler, which I had been for 31 years, but which the year gave me a particular occasion to be, and which I have been doing in these pages in a way, I hope, is adequate to the events I have described. What I want to say is this. I am not a man who believes in inevitability. I have seen too many things go wrong that had no reason to go wrong, and too many things go right that had no reason to, and I have learned over 31 years to hold the word asterisk inevitable with a great deal of skepticism, because it is generally the word we use after something has happened to pretend that it could not have been otherwise. But I will say this. There are some combinations of two people in which the question of whether they suit each other is answered by every small thing they do in each other's presence, where the answer is accumulating from the beginning, in the quality of the conversations and the specific attention they give each other, and the way each one becomes slightly more fully themselves in the company of the other. I watched that accumulation over the year of the 12 refusals in the corridor conversations and the catalogue room and the North Field and the East Tower room, and in the library and the drawing room and the birthday breakfast and the beetle box, and I wrote it all down. And I stand by all of it. The Duke of Caldermere refused 12 women over the course of a season and returned to a house that contained the only one he actually wanted. She taught his sister to read and to think, and to look at snowdrops and ask why they opened differently on the eastern side of the garden. She walked the hall every afternoon because she wanted to know its shape. She kept a box of beetles under her bed and added to it throughout the year, including 6 from Caldermere's grounds. He noticed, eventually, with the particular lateness of a man who has been paying attention all along and simply has not yet named what he is attending to. She waited, with the particular patience of a woman who has learned not to name things too soon, who knows the difference between what is real and what is hoped for, and who, once she was sure, was entirely sure. Cecily managed the whole operation from November, with a small horse for a signature and an extraordinary clarity about what the people she loved needed, and what she could do to produce the conditions for them to find it. I wrote it down, and Caldermere, which had been very well maintained and not quite alive, is alive. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. I should record one final December scene, because December came and the year rounded back to itself, and the hall on a December evening with a fire in the eastern drawing room is the image I carry when I think of what Caldermere became. The reading aloud continued. Cecily read on Thursday evenings throughout November and into December, the same novel as before and then a new one, and the household gathered around it in the way that households gather around things that are good and regular and dependable. The cook sometimes came to listen from the doorway. Dot sat in the corner with her mending. I sat in my habitual chair by the second window, and the Duke sat in his habitual chair by the fire, and the Duchess sat. And this was the change, the small daily evidence of what had been resolved beside him. Not performing beside him. Simply beside him, the way a person sits when that is where they belong. On a Thursday in the middle of December, Cecily read the final chapter of the novel she had been working through. The ending of it was, as good endings are, inevitable in retrospect and genuinely surprising in the moment. The two characters who had been circling each other throughout finally in the same room, finally direct with each other, finally past the managing and the containing. When she finished, Cecily closed the book. "That's done," she said. "Well, read," the Duchess said. "Thank you," Cecily said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. Then she said to the fire or to the room or to the year that was almost finished, "I think this was a good year." The Duke looked at his sister. "Do you?" he said. "Yes," Cecily said. "I think it was the best year." She looked at him, then at the Duchess. "Both together, that is, as a unit, the three of us." The Duchess said very quietly, "Yes." The Duke said nothing for a moment. Then, "Yes," he said. The word came out with the particular weight that it has when a man who does not use words casually uses one that contains, inside it, everything he might otherwise have said with 40. The fire burned. Dot finished her mending. I sat by the second window and held the year in my mind, and it had the weight of something real, the actual weight of a real year, which is heavier and better than the things we put in the journals, because the journals are only the record and the year is the thing itself. But the record is what we have. And this is the record. The year was good, the choice was right, the house is alive. The river sounds excellent tonight,